It really freaked me out when I discovered the first one. Not that it doesn't now, but the first was a massive shock to the system. I mean, who wouldn't be downright horrified at the sight of a dead girl dangling from a tree branch? The one who put her there. That's who. I was 18 when I came across the mutilated corpse. That day will always stick out in my mind. It was ground zero, the catalyst for the demented circus act that my life would devolve into. Little did I know, it would all be downhill from there. Cheer up, dude. Being held back isn't the end of the world. Just means you get more opportunities to hit on that cute sophomore you've been crushing on. Jacob smirked, nudging my arm. I sighed. It's not the end of the world, but it might as well be. While all of you get to prance across that stage, I'll be stuck shoveling waste in the pig pen. Jacob stayed silent. A breeze swept through the air, rustling the crisp brown and yellow leaves that littered the ground. He knew I was right. I was the farmer's son, and my father viewed me as nothing more than free labor, an otherwise useless, good-for-nothing piece of equipment to be tossed to the curb once I lost my value. And with how abhorrent my grades were, I wasn't exactly proving him wrong. I mean, look on the bright side. Maybe you can. Jacob trailed off, and I nearly bumped into him. What gives, man? You can't just stop right in front of me like that, I grumbled, beginning to step around him. Jacob suddenly reached out and grabbed my arm. A pang of fear jolted through my chest. Jacob was a thin, bony boy with less muscle than SpongeBob SquarePants. Nevertheless, he maintained a grip so tight around my wrist that I thought it might snap. Before I could ask him what in the world he thought he was doing, he pointed to a tree in a nearby clearing. That's when I noticed the body. My heart plummeted into my stomach. Adrenaline surged through my veins as my fight or flight began to kick in. Though every synapse in my brain screamed at me to run, I found myself glued to the spot. Grayson, is that what I think it is? Jacob muttered, shattering my morbid reverie. I'm pretty sure. What do we do? Should we call the cops? How has no one seen it by now? I'm gonna get a closer look, Jacob murmured as he started to trudge toward the suspended remains. I debated on leaving. I wanted to put as much distance between me and that gruesome scene as I possibly could, but in the end, my curiosity won out. I can't believe I'm doing this, I mumbled, trotting to catch up to my friend. We continued to walk through the open field until we stood directly in front of it. I don't know why, but I hadn't expected the smell. The putrid stench of rot and decay swam into my nostrils well before we reached the cadaver. It nearly made me gag from how overpowering it was. Once we were right up on it, I was really able to drink in its features. The deceased was a woman. It made me nauseous the way her corpse was softly swaying in the wind. Thin, black hair clung to her blood-spattered nightgown. I think it was white at one time, but the fabric had degraded to a deep yellow. Her brittle, pallid appendages hung limply, never to regain mobility again. But worst of all was her face. The woman's pale blue eyes were bulging from her skull. Dried blood trailed from the sockets, down her cheeks, and eventually pooled at the noose secured tightly around her neck. That was what really got me. Her eyes. I could still see the pain and fear behind each of her protruding irises, and my heart absolutely shattered for her. I couldn't stand to look any longer. Jacob, I'm calling the police. We shouldn't be here. What if the killer is hiding nearby? He turned to me, mouth still slightly agape. Why, yeah, the cops. You're right, let's go. Jacob and I returned to the sidewalk where we'd first noticed the woman while I dialed 911. The phone rang for longer than it should have before the operator's voice cut through the line. 911, what is your emergency? The woman sounded exhausted, like years upon years of 2 packs a day were whittling down her lung capacity. Hi, yes, I found a dead body. Can you send somebody to, I dunno, take her to the morgue, I guess. What is your location? Emergency services. We'll be en route momentarily, coming up on the intersection of Maple Road and Cherry Street. Please hurry. The operator suddenly cleared her throat, effectively cutting me off. Pardon me, but you said the intersection of Maple Road and Cherry Street, yes. My brows furrowed. The lady on the other end of the line had dropped her reassuring facade. She sounded almost accusatory. Yeah, that's right, sir. Please continue to go about your day. Nothing is out of the ordinary at the intersection of Cherry and Maple. Services will not be dispatched. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Everything was normal. I'd just seen a lynching victim with my own 2 eyes, and the operator was telling me that was normal. No, maybe you misheard me. I said there's a dead body. I need you to send someone. The line was silent for a tense moment before the woman's voice cut back over my phone speaker. Please do not submit a false report again, or you will face legal repercussions. Have a nice day. This isn't a joke. Hello, hello. My persistence did no good. The operator hung up on me. So what they say? Are they sending someone? Jacob asked, gazing up at me expectantly. No, actually, I said, lowering the phone from my ear. They told me nothing was wrong. I was left in complete shock for the remainder of the day. If the police wouldn't take me seriously, that left me little choice but to go home and try to erase it from my memory. But I just couldn't. The image of that woman's lifeless corpse was permanently seared into my brain. I felt like I owed it to her to find justice, or at the very least, someone to give her a proper burial. Grayson, dinner, Mom shouted. I'll be there in a second. I yelled back, gently placing the last of the freshly laid eggs into my basket. The one good thing about being an involuntary farmhand, it helped keep my mind occupied. At least it was good for something. I silently joined my parents at the table. Mom set a plateful of meatloaf and mashed potatoes before me. Normally, I would have demolished it, but in light of what I'd witnessed earlier that day, I didn't know if my appetite would ever come back. Why aren't you eating, honey? You've barely touched your potatoes. Is something wrong? Mom asked, a twinge of concern percolating her words. Yeah, so, this is gonna sound crazy, but spit it out. Boy, Dad interjected through a mouthful of food. I saw a dead body today. My parents locked eyes with one another. Dad gulped down his food, but he didn't motion to take another bite. Mom stared silently at him, sweat beading on her brow. That was probably nothing, just a leftover display from Halloween. Mom chuckled nervously. Your mother is right, Dad affirmed, flashing me a toothy grin. It was probably just a figment of your imagination. No need for concern. The fork trembled in his grasp as he stabbed a slab of meatloaf. Don't worry about finishing dinner. You can be excused if you're not hungry, Mom said, that anxious smile still plastered to her face. Thanks, I'm gonna take you up on that offer. I scooted my chair out from the table and returned to my duties. I didn't want to spend any more time around my folks that evening. They were acting strange, and I didn't like it one bit. Trepidation bubbled in my gut as Jacob and I walked to school. The trip was marred by a tense, uneasy silence. Then, Jacob said what was on both of our minds. Grayson, do you think she'll still be there? I sure hope not, I said, keeping my eyes locked to the ground. We each subconsciously held our breaths as we approached the clearing. I prayed that the woman would be gone. My heart palpitated wildly in my chest, blood rushing in my ears. I clenched my eyes shut as we came into view, and there it was. A grass clearing sat before us. Daisies and dandelions swayed among the lush, green blades. I peered beyond it, into the trees. I suddenly grew lightheaded. She was still there. The woman's lifeless, decaying corpse hung from the rope, those horrible, unblinking eyes visible even from our distance. I felt like I was going to be sick. The cops had completely ignored my call. Without warning, Jacob took off in a dead sprint. I gave chase, my legs pumping as fast as they could carry me. They ran and ran, all the way until we'd reached the school. I didn't even need to ask Jacob why he'd done it. I was probably going to do the same eventually. I couldn't focus for the remainder of the day. The hands on the clock seemed to tick by in slow motion. I couldn't stop thinking about her. Those bulging, desperate eyes. I couldn't escape them. After the longest day of my life, I again found myself by Jacob's side, walking home. We didn't say anything to each other. We just kept going, dreading the encounter that we knew would come. We gradually approached the clearing. I couldn't do it. Not again. But I had to. It was like a train wreck. Something so demented and screwed up that you just can't bring yourself to look away. Alright, man, I'm going to run the rest of the way. Your call if you want to come with, Jacob said, already turning away from me. Go ahead, I'll join you in a sec, I muttered, wondering if I was making the right decision. Suit yourself, Jacob retorted, averting his gaze from the field before jogging past. This was it, the last time. One more look, then I'd never peer into those woods again. I was done, that's what I told myself, at least. I steeled my resolve and quickly glanced at the tree that I'd previously seen the woman hanging from. I immediately regretted it. I bent over and lost my lunch all over the dried leaves littering the ground. Because when I glanced up at that tree, the woman wasn't alone. There was a man dangling from the branch opposite her, connected to the bough from an almost identical noose. His eyes mirrored the woman's, two fear-struck, bloodied orbs jutting from his head, congealed, viscous liquid oozing down his neck. I couldn't take it any longer. I sprinted after Jacob and didn't stop until I reached my house. What was going on? Were the cops working with a serial killer? Even if they were, why wouldn't they at least come pick up the bodies? Fortunately, I'd never received the answer to some of those questions. Some, but not all. It didn't stop with those two. Bodies began appearing in trees at an alarming rate, and they weren't just confined to the clearing anymore. The dead were popping up everywhere, in the big oak by the library and the maple tree in front of town hall. Hell, a dead man even showed up hanging from the beech tree on the school's front lawn. Only once was it ever anyone I recognized. I knew Kent Taylor. He was the owner of a little diner off Main Street. He was one of the nicest men I'd ever met. Needless to say, when his body appeared swinging from a rope on my walk home, I burst into tears. He didn't deserve that. None of them did. I desperately wanted to get to the bottom of the whole thing. But what could I do? No one was willing to talk about it, and the police were utterly useless. I tried to contact them multiple times, but in the end, I was given a warning for submitting a false report. I was caught between a rock and a hard place, so, left with seemingly no other option, I turned a blind eye. Obviously, I was terrified beyond belief, but I think we all were. Everyone seemed on edge, like we were all anticipating something that none of us wanted to acknowledge. Time marched slowly by, agonizingly so. Each day felt longer than its predecessor. Still, after what seemed like an eternity, the day finally came. Jacob's graduation. A whirlwind of emotions swirled within me as I sat and watched my classmates walk across the stage. Huge, content grins were plastered across their faces, the light in their eyes burning brightly. It should have been me up there accepting my diploma. It wasn't fair that all my peers got to escape this hellhole, while I was forced to endure for another year. It just wasn't. I waved as Jacob accepted his diploma from the dean. He beamed back at me, not a worry in the world. Though jealousy burned inside me like a hot iron, I managed to suppress it. I wished so badly that I could have adopted Jacob's same carefree attitude, even just for a moment. Now, I'm not so sure. Once the ceremony was complete, I swam through the crowd to meet my friend. Just a quick congratulations, and I'd be on my way. No point in sticking around any longer. Jacob, congrats, buddy, I said, clasping him on the shoulder. He reciprocated my greeting with a warm smile. Thank you, Gray. I really appreciate you coming. I would have understood if you wanted to stay home and have to pick up crusty cow patties. Hell no, I wouldn't miss it for the world. Jacob chuckled, his grin growing even wider. Even if I was consumed by envy, that didn't make me any less proud of him. It really does mean a lot to me, more than you know. Heck, I might even miss this place a little because of you, he quipped, drawing a smile to my own face. I lightly slugged him in the arm. Oh, who are you kidding? You and I both know that won't happen. Remind me again, where are you running off to this summer? Landed an internship at Prentice Financial. I'll be going to Boston for the next couple months, remember? Yeah, I do remember you telling me that now. Live it up for the both of us, man, and try not to forget about me, okay? It's gonna be real lonely around here without you, you know. Me, forget about you. Wouldn't dream of it, he said, shooting me a wink. 2 weeks from that day, Jacob was scheduled to fly out. I didn't get to see him off, but I wished him the best. I didn't notice anything out of the ordinary at first, not until he started ignoring my texts. I thought that maybe he'd just been busy with the move. I mean, it's stressful to leave the place you've called home for your entire life and start new. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, though. I should have listened to my gut. It was another 3 days before I found him. Dad had sent me to the corner store to pick up some salt when I happened to glance up at the tree overshadowing the old-timey little shop. I will never forget what I saw. Jacob's lifeless corpse stared back at me. His eyes bulged from his skull, and tiny rivulets of dried blood streamed down his cheeks. My heart shattered, and simultaneously began to race in my chest. Jacob, my best friend in the entire world, was strung up like a puppet, and not a single soul acknowledged him. I dropped to my knees and wept. I cried and cried, ignoring strange looks from passers-by. It wasn't right. Jacob never hurt a fly. He didn't deserve to die. Not like that. I stood back up with a newfound rage bubbling within me. I was going to find out who did this to him, and I was going to make them pay. I abandoned the salt on the sidewalk. I didn't care what Dad would say. He could get his own damn salt if he needed it so badly. I continued on my warpath, straight to the only place that I knew I could find some answers. Jacob's house. I knocked furiously on the front door, anger simmering over all the while. Jacob's parents would tell me something. They had to. Jacob's mother answered the door. Her eyes were puffy and sullen, like she'd been crying for days on end. I couldn't help but feel sorry for her. Our only son was brutally murdered, and the police didn't give two damns about it. That extinguished my ire just a bit. Mrs. Allen, please don't blow me off. I need to know who did this to him and why. Tears began to cloud my vision. The reality of my grim discovery still hadn't fully set in. Did what? To whom? She replied. Her voice was defeated and hoarse. She was hiding something. You know who? Jacob, your son. I found his body by the corner store. Please, Mrs. Allen, please tell me who did this. Jacob. No, Jacob is in Boston. He's an intern. My boy is doing just fine, she replied despondently, staring into space. Jacob is not fine. Please, you have to. It was nice of you to stop by. Grayson, tell your parents we said hello. And with that, the door shut in my face. It's been 2 days since then. I have a theory, and I'm going to test it. I have to know, for Jacob's sake. I think whoever is doing this is killing anyone who tries to leave. So tonight, I'm going to find out for myself if that's true. I've got a cousin who lives in a major city. She said it's okay if I crash at her place for a while. Either I'm going to get out of here, or I'm going to die trying. I'm going to take Dad's pickup truck and pray that it doesn't give out on me. I'm posting this in case I don't make it out. Please heed my warning. If you drive through a town called Walnut Valley in northern Kentucky, don't stick around, because if you do, you might not make it out alive. It all started when I was 16. It was Halloween, and my friends and I all had a bit too much fun pushing each other to do something dumber and dumber. We'd snatched a bottle of Rev from my parents' stash and passed it around when one of us came up with the idea to check out the old mall by the freeway. The place had been closed a few years prior, and none of us had been there more than a couple of times as kids, but we figured it could make for a good story. The 5 of us crammed into a car and made our way out there, blasting music as we went along. Godsmack, Pod, PM 5K, Head PE. It was a different time. Rod was up in the front seat trying to smoke something, but the rest of us kept interrupting him. He had this stupid hang-up on a joke where, if you even reminded him of it, he wouldn't stop laughing. It could boil down to a single word, and he'd burst. As we got there and poured out on the concrete, a chill passed through me, more so than the autumn air. The pillars outside reminded me of a ribcage, making the whole place look like a giant concrete corpse. In the dark of a Halloween night, pretty much anything can look terrifying. That's just where your mind wanders. We made our way in through a loosely boarded glass door. Stepping inside, all the light we had were our flip phones, and the moon slipping in through the skylight. I'd been in that mall a handful of times over the years, but what I was seeing there and then was something different. Without the people and the ads and the billboards and the stalls, it was just a husk, something left behind. Still, we found a bunch of stuff. There were still metal racks in one of the old clothing stores, which we could climb. There was a counter at the old sandwich place where we could pretend to take orders. There were windows to break and these huge empty spaces where our voices would carry all throughout the building. The only place that held some sort of reverence to us was the toy store on the 2nd floor. That had once been the center of our attention. We were still just 16, and most of us remembered a time when we would beg our parents for a trip there. It had been the biggest toy store in our world, and there was always something new to look at. But seeing it then, and there, it was just as dead as the rest of the place. Not even the sign remained. As the others made their way inside, I split off to take a walk, lighting up the hall with my phone. They mocked me on my way, saying whoever splits off the group is always the first to die in horror movies. Hilarious. I went past what remained of the old stores, the gift shop, the flower boutique, the bookstore. I could almost see them, but only in my mind. Now it was all concrete and cheap sandstone tiling. The place wasn't even old enough to be dusty yet, remaining in this sort of space between living and dead, like a man on life support. It'd only take the flip of a switch, and this whole place would come alive, ready to welcome people back. But of course, that wouldn't happen. Then, at the end of the hall, I came to a full stop. It turns out, we weren't the first people with the idea to come here. There was a resting area. In the far back, a sort of alcove, benches set around an empty space, where stalls were supposed to be, all centered around this massive red marble column. I called the others over, they had to see this. My voice easily carried all the way across the mall, and the others came running. Someone had been here. They'd flipped all the benches onto their backs and placed several pots and planters in a circle around the column. Hell, they even planted something. I could see little blue sprouts poking up. But the freakiest thing was the column itself. They'd taken the old mall posters and plastered the thing with them. These posters were just the picture of a smiling middle-aged woman dressed in a sort of 50s attire, a generic yellow sundress with little white flowers on it. She also had the most generic stock photo smile you could imagine. To her right, on every poster, was a cartoonish speech bubble. They were just old sayings, bordering on cliches, like Mama used to make M, the more the merrier, happily ever after. But the freaky thing was not the posters themselves, but what'd been done to them. Someone had burned out the eyes, leaving them covered in scorch marks. With the red marble in the back, my brain sort of short-circuited, making me think I was looking into her empty eye sockets. Seeing the gore behind the eyes, it was unsettling and probably intentional. They'd also modified some of the sayings, crossing out certain words, like Mama used to make M, the more the merrier, happily ever after. It was unsettling. Some of us caught the Halloween vibe of it, thinking it fit perfectly with what we were up to. Others could sense it, like me, that this wasn't just a fun thing someone did for fun. This was deranged. It must have taken hours to arrange this sort of scene, and we couldn't imagine a good reason to do it. "That's Lady Lockley," said Rod, pointing up at the posters. "I had a crush on her. Looks like my babysitter. She's like 50, I added. "Still got a great rack." The others agreed. It was funny, but I couldn't bring myself to laugh. This felt like rot. In the same way that a corpse decays, this was the way old buildings decayed. It made me feel filthy, like I was some kind of bacteria infecting this place and breaking it down, corrupting it, digesting it. I felt sorry for Lady Lockley. She deserved better, a happily ever after. Once we got bored of wandering around, we made our way back to the entrance. On the other side of the building, one of the guys squealed in delight. He'd found a ball pit. Looking at it, it was clear that this thing wasn't sanitary. We could hear something moving in it, probably rats. Part of the ceiling had collapsed, leaving a dead wire hanging like an open nerve, and the whole place was covered in a thin layer of concrete dust. "Someone's gotta go in," they said. "We ain't leaving until someone goes in." "Not me," I added. "No way," and that settled it. I was the first to decline. I had to be the first to go in, no matter if I wanted to or not. The others grabbed me and pushed me into the deep end, face first. Plastic balls rattled against my ears. I was fully prepared to be drenched in rat piss and bites, but nothing happened. There was concrete dust covering my scalp and forehead, but apart from that, I was fine. It tickled my nose a bit. The pit was deep enough to reach about halfway up my body, but I'd sunk to the bottom. I could feel the rubber flooring against my cheek. The others were lighting me up with their phones. The lights coming through the balls made a sort of kaleidoscope of pastel colors, stretching the shadows out into wan, distorted shapes. As I struggled to regain my balance, I fumbled around with my hands, trying instinctively to grab something, but instead, something grabbed me. It was only a silhouette, a face, somewhere in the swirl of colors, the shape of a head with two holes where the eyes were supposed to be. It gasped excitedly. Even from a distance, I could taste the ammonia on its breath. Its icy fingers interlocked with mine, wanting to bring me closer. I recoiled, shaking my head. I think I let out a scream, but I don't remember doing it. My pulse shot through the roof as I forced myself back to my feet, scrambling to get back to the others. They were laughing their asses off, thinking I was just surprised. As my head breached the surface, they were standing in a half circle, shining their lights at me. Of course, there was nothing in the ball pit. I wiped my dusty hair and prepared myself to drag one or two of them down there with me, but something in the air changed. Their faces went from gleeful joy to careful curiosity to worry. Turning back towards the pit, I could see why. On the side of every ball in the ball pit was an eye, lovingly hand-painted with a Sharpie. The others helped me up and tried to diffuse the tension with puns and jabs. It didn't take long for the chill to leave our spines, but it took me the longest. Looking down at my hand, I felt cold, like something had really touched me, something just as real as that mall and the people who'd invaded it. We left shortly after, taking the car back to town, blasting our music again. We filled the rest of the night with more stolen wine, games, dares, and laughs, but something in me had changed. I couldn't let go of that image of Lady Lockley and the red marble in the back of her head. Through every chuckle and every smile, that feeling held me back. Something had changed, forever. That night, as I slept on Rod's couch, I watched the moonlight cast a shadow on the opposite wall. The cross of the window shaped the light into 4 perfect squares. As I lay there, half drunk, and half sleeping, I imagined them as little television screens, each showing whatever came to mind. Old memories, dreams, hopes, but every made-up show I imagined always ended the same way, with the mental image of a middle-aged 1950s housewife, her dead smile, a southern drawl, and the red, infected cavity in her skull where her eyes ought to be. The next day, it all felt like a bad dream. Some of the guys were hungover, and most of us just made our way back home to sleep it off. I didn't want to go home. My parents were so focused on my older brother at the time that they didn't care what I did. He was the one with the problems. I could get away with pretty much anything. Being gone for a day was nothing compared to a heroin addiction. Still, I had to get back home. Much like expected, my parents weren't around. They'd left a note to say there were some leftovers in the fridge, and that I could call them if I needed something. But that was it. I had never once called them on that number. Making my way up to my room, I stopped. We have these 2 windows at the top of the staircase, with 2 knobs in the middle. For a moment, I imagined those 2 knobs as little eyes. I could imagine them blinking all throughout the day and the next. This would become a repeating pattern. 2 coins on the counter could send a shiver up my spine. The rings of a scissor grip would make me think of those gaping eye sockets. 2 soda cans, with their pull tabs standing at attention, brought me the same image. Every combination of 2 circles, spheres, or rings, it all forced that image back into my head. That joyless smile of Lady Lockley and her icy fingers interlocking with mine, bringing me closer. It came to a point where people started to notice. For example, when I had dinner with my parents, they had a beer each. The bottles were right next to one another, and the top of the bottles formed these 2 holes. It took me a while to notice, but when I did, I couldn't stop thinking about it. It physically made me itch, and I had this intense need to separate them. Once I did, the 2 of them just looked at me, not a word spoken. I tried to ignore it. I reorganized my space to make sure there was nothing around to remind me, but every now and then there'd be something. It could be something as little as 2 people passing on the street, and their heads reminding me of floating eyeballs. But it got worse. Once, as I stepped out of the shower, I spotted myself in the mirror. Even seeing my own eyes looking back at me sent me into this spiraling anxiety. I could imagine myself eyeless, with that infected red cavity in the back of my skull. I could see it. I could see it to the point where I convinced myself that it was true, that I had no eyes to begin with. My eyes would close, and I couldn't bring myself to open them. I would try to pry them open with my fingers, kneeling on the cold bathroom tiles, but it wouldn't work. Nothing would. Come on, I'd cry. Come the hell on. But it just wouldn't work. It was so infuriating that it tickled the back of my brain into a joyless smile. The same kind of smile that Lady Lockley wore on those posters. No one else was suffering from this. I had no one to talk to, and no one would understand why I was feeling that way. It was impossible to describe, and to a group of guys who mostly talked about women and games, there wouldn't be much interest in mental health. So I decided I'd do something about it myself. Much like exposure therapy, I had to go back. I was going to tear down every poster, set fire to the ball pit, and prove to myself that there was nothing to fear. I was going to destroy it, and with it, Lady Lockley. I was going to break those icy fingers and stare into her eyeless face, unflinching. I had this crappy moped that I'd saved up for one summer. Enough time had passed for the first Minnesota snow to fall, so I had to be careful not to slip and slide. I loaded up a backpack with all kinds of destructive tools. I didn't even bother to read the note left on the kitchen counter this time. No one else was going to fix me, so I had to do it myself. I kept the wheels steady, feeling the snow slush stain my cheap jeans, cold water soaking into my second-hand shoes. By the time I got there, I was shivering. A cold wind had picked up from the overcast, and there was no moonlight to guide me this time. Still, I'd prepared. I had a great flashlight, with plenty of spare batteries packed away. My dad had this battery box in the garage, full of whatever kind he might possibly need. I brought the whole thing. I made my way inside through the loosely boarded up doors. The place felt warmer, but maybe it was just me being angry. I had this frustration pent up in me, forcing me forward. I went past all the hollowed shops, the broken benches, the empty planters, and the dry fountain. I climbed up the dead escalator and followed the familiar shops towards the resting area. I could see the red marble column from afar, sticking out like a sore nerve, the posters plastered to it like a band-aid to an open wound. My footsteps echoed as I made my way closer, clutching the flashlight harder. There were little sprouts in the pots, and planters now, some with a little blue bud, others had barely poked through the dirt. One had grown quite tall. There were more posters now. Some had been stuck to the walls, others lay strewn about on the floor. Someone had been there recently, I could tell. A few chairs from one of the downstairs restaurants had been dragged up there and smashed, forming a kind of plastic half circle across the floor. It didn't matter to me. This was all going to burn either way. I put down my backpack and brought out a bottle of gasoline. My dad always kept a spare can in the garage, but I didn't want to bring the whole thing, so I just filled up 3 plastic bottles. Instead, I unscrewed the top and just started chucking it at the column, tainting the posters. They were made with some kind of plastic that didn't react well to gasoline, making part of the ink melt a little, making Lady Lockley's smile into a frown, and then a garbled mess. I went all around the column, using 2 of my 3 bottles. It was messy, and I got a whole lot of it on clothes. I would have to wash it when I got back. My parents didn't ask a lot of questions, but if I were to come back home drenched in gasoline, they might have something to say. As I finished, I put down my bag again and got a hold of a lighter, one of those with a long neck for lighting fancy candles. I tried to wipe the gasoline off my hands, but doubt was getting to me. I didn't want to set myself on fire. Then again, this place had to die. For a brief moment, I got stuck staring at the posters. Even with the ink melting off, the holes remained. Dozens of empty eye sockets staring back at me, some with a barely human face attached. Some were relatively unscathed, still carrying the various slogans and sayings of Lady Lockley. There was even a fully intact happily ever after poster smiling back at me. I put away my flashlight, letting the darkness of the place overwhelm me. The overcast was doing me no favors. I held the lighter up, inched closer, and clicked it. A single light in the dark. But something was wrong. A chill worked its way across my right cheek, making me squint. Then, a breath of air. A light disappeared, and my nostrils were assaulted by the sudden smell of ammonia. And right behind me, grazing my cheek, was something cold. Something that was gently placing its fingers on my left shoulder, inching up towards my neck. I bent down, snatched up my flashlight, and turned around. The cone of light swayed back and forth, finding nothing as I backed away. My feet were stepping on their own, seemingly out of my control. My lungs felt stiff, like I couldn't push any air into them. There were puffs of smoke with every little forced, panting breath. I wasn't alone. I didn't even think about how far I backed up until my back hit the red marble pillar. I just stood there, frozen. I could feel the eyeless holes turning towards me, judging me, waiting for me to turn around. Something was running down my arm. It made its way all the way to my fingers. I looked down, only to see fresh blood. Droplets formed at the edge of my fingertips, pulling up and dropping to the floor. The back of my head felt wet, same with the back of my pants and jacket. I carefully stepped away and turned to face the pillar. Blood. It wasn't just red marble, it was bleeding. The gasoline had made the posters slip off, falling to the floor one by one, leaving the pillar raw and unprotected. Little pools of blood ran across the floor. It was so quiet, just little tips and taps of drops hitting the floor, mixing with the echoes of my breathing. I could hear the battery in the flashlight rattling as my hands shook from the cold, and in the distance, a hiss. My ears homed in on the sound, a whisper coming from one of the nearby stores. Put them back. I just stood there, trying to comprehend what I was hearing, what it was demanding. Then, from another store across the mall, a louder sound. Put it all back. And from a third store, an old fast food kitchen. Put me back. Looking down at the pools of gasoline and blood mixing with the misshaped plastic posters, I shook my head. I didn't want this anymore. All the anger had turned to fear, and all I wanted was to grab my stuff and leave. I'm going, I said. I won't come back. There was no response. Just like back home, there was no one to listen to me. Maybe I was speaking to an empty room, making up stories in my head. I won't come back. I repeated. This is it. Screw your stupid mall. And screw whatever game you think you're playing. I won't. I suddenly choked on my breath. I could see them in the distance, human shapes stepping out of the storefronts, all with the same cheerful yellow dress, the same hair, the same smile. Then, something grabbed me. It wasn't like the first time, where icy fingers daintily slipped into my hand, but something violent, angry, nails digging into my scalp, grabbing a handful of my hair, forcing me forward with a dead man's cramped grip. I went from standing, to kneeling, to having my face pressed into the floor in a heartbeat. There were more than 2 hands. maybe 4, 5, something heavy pushed against my spine. No, it wasn't just one word, it was a choir, a dozen identical voices, speaking as one from across the mall. 2 cold fingers touched my eyelids, forcing me to blink. I forced my eyes shut, trying to squint them away. I could barely breathe. I tried moving my head away, shaking the fingers off, but I couldn't. No matter how far back I forced myself, they pushed on until the pain started. This mounting pressure causing bright, painful spots to dance across the inside of my head. It was excruciating. I was panicking, trying to turn, but I couldn't. There was this raw, primal emotion bubbling inside me, forcing me to scream. I begged and pleaded, but it was too late. I'd wronged them, and they were relentless. Had it gone any further, I'd be blind today, maybe dead, but it didn't. I heard distant footsteps approaching and felt the fingers slowly let up. Pressure released from my spine, and the hands holding me down loosened their grip. I slowly opened my eyes, blinking away the spots of pain, only to see a man. He had a flashlight of his own, casting deep shadows on his wrinkled face. He must have been in his early 60s, and was dressed in some kind of maintenance getup. A janitor, perhaps. He walked up to me as the last hand let go and offered to help me up. I accepted it, and got back on my feet. I didn't dare to turn around. I could hear them, feel them, smell the ammonia. "Don't do anything stupid," he whispered. "Give them a moment." We just stood there. I looked down, trying my best not to bring any attention to myself. At the edge of my vision, I could see flowery yellow dresses shuffle past me, back into the empty storefronts, back into the mall. He patted me on the shoulder, and I looked up. The last silhouette slipped into an old outlet space, leaving the 2 of us alone. He got some blood on his hands from touching my shoulder, and wiped it off on his legs. He stepped back to pick up something he'd brought, a stack of posters and a toolbox. Walking up to me, he had this almost apologetic look on his face. "So she picked you too," he sighed. "That makes, what, 4 of us, using a bucket and a still working hose in the back. We got enough water and soap to clean the pillar a bit. It had stopped bleeding, coagulated in a way. We ended up putting up new posters, still with the eyes burned out. She likes them this way," he said. "The kids always did this to the posters, long before the place closed. She thinks they're supposed to look like this." We spent some time collecting scrap and piling it into a circle around the pillar, and drawing eyes on various white surfaces. She doesn't have any eyes of her own, so she needs us to give her some. We spent hours just wandering around, touching up the place, watering the plants, cleaning up the gasoline. The Lady Lockleys seemed calmer. I could see them shuffling about in the back of the stores, catching a reflection off their perfect teeth every now and then. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that any threat to this place would have me swarmed. "Do you have to do this?" I asked. "Like, often?" "Yeah," he nodded. "What happens if you don't?" "I think you know what happens." At the end of the night, as I left the mall behind, I saw a final swaying flowery dress in the cracks of the wooden boards. Even now, I was being watched, judged. Wait, but for the moment, I was safe. At first I went back like once a week. Once I brought ping pong balls and painted eyes on them. They seemed to like that. Another time, I filled up the water fountain. The janitor would return at times too, bringing freshly printed posters and scrubbing the floor. No wonder it wasn't dusty. I tried to stop going back there, but it would just build this pressure in me. I'd feel her ire. I would start to focus on circles and spheres, as if my body was reminding me that I was being watched. I'd sometimes feel something cold at the edge of my vision, something icy brushing against my ear. It would put me on edge, as if expecting something to grab me at any moment. For that damned smile to come out of the dark and become the last thing I ever see. Places like this don't get torn down. The land is dirt cheap, and the effort to break and ship off all that concrete just isn't worth it. It remains there to this day. I would go back every now and then to fix the place up, to make sure she was happy enough to leave me alone. Weeks would turn to months, and over time, they trusted me enough to come back only once every 6 months or so. I'd make a day out of it. The plants would blossom into these 6 feet tall radiant blue sunflowers, and a creeping vine would slither up the side of the marble pillar. She seemed to like the vines. Sometimes, there are new people. I don't really know their names, but we can kinda recognize each other at a glance. Some young, some old. We've tried to board the place up to keep people out, but every now and then some smartass gets through. I don't think they all make it out. Some of the things I've seen over the years tell a gruesome story of their own. I'm in my mid-30s now. I've done this for half my life, as a sort of stewardship, a part of my life that I can't share with anyone. I've gotten to know her wants and needs. There is a personality there, and intelligence. Sometimes they can get these strange whims. I once saw one of them trying to break through the loose boards, only to be dragged away by the others. I've seen them gently caress the leaves of the sunflowers. I've seen them dance on tables, walk hand in hand down the empty walkways, and once, just staring up at the moon. I think she's like an immune system, like something remaining to stop the decay. This building has been closed for decades, but from looking at it, you couldn't tell. Most buildings that have been empty for that long just looks weighed down and worn, but not the Dead Eye Mall. It's still spry and waiting, as if expecting people to come back, and every now and then they do, but it is a service I perform under threat of death, and to this day it terrifies me. While I'm not as bothered by circles or rings, I still have this feeling that I should be, like I shouldn't be normalizing this. I shouldn't have to compromise to something unnatural and otherworldly, but I just don't know what the alternative is. I have this feeling that sooner or later she'll turn to me, dissatisfied, and that day she'll interlock her fingers with mine and drag me to a dark place I can't come back from ever after. Someone was screaming. The sound pulled me from a dream, and I woke in the dark, short of breath and damp with sweat. It was my mother, I realized. Have you ever noticed how you can recognize the voice of one close to you through as little as a cough or cry? There is no need for words. I heard and knew it was her. I sat up in bed, confused, frightened. The screams had stopped, but I could still hear talking downstairs. My parents. I slid out from beneath the covers and crept to my door, bare feet cold on the ancient wooden boards. A decade has passed, but I still remember the strangest details. The way those floorboards creaked, the dust which made me sneeze, the shadows of night clouds slipping silently across the scene, nipping at my heels. All these things, as meaningless as they were, are burned into me, little scars when I close my eyes. Mom and Dad's voices were raised, upset. In our old home they would have woken the neighbors by now, but not here in the middle of nowhere. There was no one within a mile. I held the door handle and eased it down so it made no sound. Stepped into the hallway, leaving my door open behind me. Moonlight spilled out around my feet, a pale wash chasing shadows into corners. It felt like I had only been asleep a few hours, but I couldn't be certain. I worked my way to the top of the stairs a few inches at a time. I could make out occasional words from below, but nothing yet that made any sense. I had stopped to listen when the door beside me cracked open, making me jump. My younger sister Maria was there, only 6 years old, wide eyes in her worried face, and tousled black hair wild around her. I recall thinking it was odd that our brother Ryan hadn't left his room. Usually if our parents woke us with their arguing, he would be up first to get us back to sleep and tell us not to worry, not to listen, go to bed. I hissed at her. She frowned and retreated, but kept the door ajar. I tiptoed forward onto the top step and listened. My father, loud, demanding, "Tell you again. Now. Don't make me do it, Lisa." "Do what?" My mother, angry, tearful, crazy. "Don't do this. Call the police. Phone an ambulance. Please, David, please." Her voice went on as I heard footsteps approaching the stairs. They were coming up, a surge of panic, and I turned, rushed back to my room. I caught my sister peering around her doorframe, and mouthed go to her as I passed. The footsteps behind grew closer, my mother's voice clearer. I climbed back in bed, heart racing, when I heard their feet on the hallway floor. They went into Ryan's room, which was opposite Maria's, not their own opposite mine. Why? I wondered. Where was my brother? Dad was speaking, voice thick and heavy. He told Mom to sit down, then again louder, and she snapped a reply I couldn't make out. "Did you break the rules I gave you?" He asked her. "Did any of you?" My mother replied, inaudible. "Did you break any of the rules I gave you?" His voice raised again. "Just answer me, Lisa." "No." Her voice broke as she shouted back. "No, please, David, for God's sake, phone an ambulance. It might not be too late. It might not. You don't know. You don't know it. Did anyone come in the house?" He cut her off, tone low and threatening. "Did any of you leave?" "No." "David, please." She was still speaking when I heard him stepping into the hall, then the door closing, and the rattle of keys. My mother's voice rose to a scream, and I could hear her run across the floor. "What are you doing?" Her hands were hammering on the door panels. "David, what are you doing? Don't hurt them, David. "Don't hurt our girls, David, please." Why would she say that? I thought, he would never hurt us. My father would never hurt me. What was going on? I heard the creak of floorboards between her cries, and then Dad opening my sister's room. He spoke quietly. I couldn't make it out. Maria's door was closed and locked. Then he was walking again towards my room. Mom was still shouting, sobbing, calling his name and our names, words collapsing into each other until they were only sounds of frustration and pain and rage. My door opened. I looked over the edge of my covers, pretending I was still sleepy. I was so scared I didn't know what else to do. My father stood in the doorway. He was holding a shotgun, and it was pointed at my chest. "Eve, sweetheart," he said, "we need to talk." We had only been in that house for a week. If everything had went to plan, we would have been gone before another month had passed. At the beginning of the year, Dad's older brother had passed away. He was the only other living member on that side of the family, so my father inherited everything. Our parents were contacted by the law firm who had been engaged as executors of the will, and a meeting was organized to discuss the detail. Now, our dad hadn't spoken to his brother in decades, or any of his side of our family for that matter. Ryan, Maria, and myself had never even met them. Dad would never talk about them. Strangely, he seemed more worried than upset by the news of our uncle's death. When my parents attended the meeting, the true scope of the inheritance was revealed. The home left to him was more than a century old and had once housed 20 family and staff, 3 floors, basement, attic, outhouses, and miles of private property. At present, most of the place was filled with the accumulated possessions of 5 generations of rich landowners. The contents alone could be worth a small fortune. The house and grounds certainly were. My mom, both shocked and delighted, couldn't wait to tell us. Dad, however, remained taciturn, simultaneously unsurprised and pained by this apparent good fortune. He didn't want to accept it, he said. Our mother couldn't believe him and demanded to know why. Because of the conditions of the will, he told her. We would all have to move there and take possession of the house. No one except family could be allowed inside, not in any circumstances. But he didn't want to go back there, no matter what was on offer. He certainly wouldn't take his wife and children to that god-forsaken place. Mom was furious. She thought it was crazy to turn it down. So what if we had to move there? His refusal to explain any further only made it worse. They argued on and off for weeks. There was silence between them each day, until the children were in bed. Then the arguments would begin. Why couldn't we accept the house? She would ask. Why wouldn't he explain? My father never answered, just repeated the same refusals and denials. Whatever happened there, it's over. I heard her say one night. He never spoke to them, never spoke about them. They're gone. I'm your wife. We are your family. Here and now. I lay awake in bed picking out bits and pieces and trying to sleep. I never heard the final argument, but Ryan did. He told me and Maria about it on our walk to school. Mom said she had spoken to a lawyer of her own about the will. We could move there, just for a short time. She had said, maybe only a month. Then we claim we can't stay because it's hurting the kids' upbringing. It wouldn't even be a lie. There isn't a school for 40 miles. Police or ambulance are further. No other families nearby. It's isolated. We say it's affecting all our mental health. There are no living relatives to contest with. My lawyer thinks we could fight it in court and win. Afterwards we sell up. We can go anywhere we like, do anything we want. We'll be rich, David. No more 5 of us in a 2-bedroom flat. We just have to make it look like we tried. My father didn't reply. Then Mom told him she would leave with us if he didn't accept it. Divorce. To be refusing this opportunity was throwing away all our futures, she said, over a reason he couldn't even explain. If he could be that stupid and selfish, then he didn't deserve to be our father and wasn't the man she had thought he was. Dad had left after that. Ryan told us, went out for hours during the night. The 2 of them didn't speak at all the next day. Then a week later our parents sat us down and said they had news. They were all going away together to clear out and sell the old house we had inherited. It should only be for a month or so, they said. Then we could come home. I need you to tell me what you've done today. Dad, I had begun to cry, unable to hold back the tears. What's going on? Why is? Just answer me, Eve. I don't want to hear anything else, okay? Tell me what happened today. And nothing else, you understand. When I drove back to the city this afternoon, did someone come to the house? Did any of you leave? Tell me the truth. He never came any closer than the doorway, keeping the gun on me the entire time. Nothing happened. I was too upset to think clearly, unable to take it all in. My mother told him we never left the house, didn't she? Why had she lied? Was Dad going to hurt her if he found out? I glanced at the wall between our rooms, and he noticed. You heard what we were saying? He asked. Me and your mom. Of course you did. I didn't reply, just wiped away the tears and tried to hold back any more. Okay, it's okay. His voice calmed. I'm not going to hurt you, baby. The barrel lowered. I could see his eyes were red where he had been crying himself. This was hurting him, I realized. Doing this was hurting him. I just need you to tell me the truth. This is very important, Eve. What did you do today? Did you go out? I was just a child, overwhelmed and confused. Every time in my life I had been frightened, I would run to my dad. Every time I needed someone, I could call his name, and he would be there. Now he was the one I was scared of, and I was lost. I started to get out of bed to go to him, but he pulled back, the gun snapping up. No, he pointed the weapon straight at me. Stay where you are, don't move. Back on the bed, there was a pleading in his eyes and voice. Please, Eve, don't make me. I had never seen him angry and emotional like this, never in my life. He had never even shouted at me before. He just wasn't that type of man. Viv, his speech quietened again. Tell me, right now, did any of you leave the house today? Yes, I saw it hit him. This truth like a physical blow sapping the strength from his body. He took a faltering step back and leaned against the doorframe, face paling to ghostly white, a sharp intake of breath through clenched teeth. We went to the village. I kept talking, not knowing what else to do. Couldn't stop the words once they had started. All of us, we got separated at the shop and Mom got angry. Maria, she ran off to see the horses. There were horses in one of the fields. I went after her, but she wouldn't come back. Mom and Ryan had to help till we found her. I remember that afternoon, chasing my sister down stone side streets under the gray sky. We were just going for a walk. My mother had told us, get out of this house for an hour, she had said, handing us our coats. But remember, don't tell your dad. She laughed, and Ryan did too. Dad was being silly, we thought, wasn't he? The four of us took a winding path through the trees and across fields of wet grass until we reached the village. A church, a shop, and a dozen homes. We found everything closed, silent. I didn't see a single other person, not even a face at a window or a passing car. Maybe no one lives here anymore, said Ryan. Mom didn't say anything. When Maria ran off, I followed but couldn't make her come back on my own. I went for my mom and brother. When I found Maria the second time, we all came home. Nothing happened. How long were you all separated? My father's words were cold now, flat and emotionless. How long were you on your own? I don't know. How long, Eve? 5 minutes, maybe 10 minutes. He wasn't looking at me anymore, just staring at the floor. He wiped the sweat from his forehead with a shaking hand and backed into the hall. Daddy, where's Ryan? He glanced up, our eyes met, and I had never seen hurt on his face like I did then. But he didn't answer me, just swung the door closed and locked it. A minute or so passed, and I could hear him pacing the floor, steps interspersed with cries from my mother which he ignored. Then his voice, just outside my room. Viv, I need you to stay here for a little while, baby. Stay away from this door. I'll be back soon, okay? A second's pause. I love you, I heard him go to my sister's room. He spoke to her briefly through the door, then he headed upstairs. My mother kept shouting, calling his name as the footsteps receded. I hadn't moved since he left, just sat there on the bed, cracked and hollowed out. Viv, Mom's voice from the next room. I went to the wall and knelt down, pressed my ear against it. Are you all right, sweetheart? She asked. I'm okay, Mom. Did I do something wrong? No, baby. No, of course not. I'm going to get us out of here, okay? It's going to be all right. He won't hurt you. I won't let him hurt you. Your dad isn't feeling well. He isn't himself. We will get him help. It's going to be okay, I promise. I could hear footsteps on the stairs again, and my mother moving away from the wall, the rattle of keys, and the door of her room opening. I stayed where I was, still and listening. Get back to the window, Lisa. My father's voice was colder than before, dead and hardened. I told you not to go out. Why did you lie to me? You were pointing that gun at me. She didn't cry anymore. Her words were clear, angry. I was scared. I didn't know what you would do if I told you. I didn't know what to say. I'd just seen. She faltered, just seen our. Stop. Tell me what happened today. We went out, like Eve told you. We went for a walk. David, a grown woman and her children went out for a walk. We're not prisoners, are we? We're not. I asked you not to. I've never asked anything of you since we've been together. His voice strained, cracking as he spoke. I never asked you to do anything for me, change anything for me. Not ever. It was just this once. I needed you to trust me, one time, and follow the rules I gave you. Why, David? Why? You order your family to follow these stupid rules. But you won't explain why. We thought you were losing your mind. All of us did. You've been so strange since we got here. You won't tell me anything. I'm your wife. And you act like I'm some idiot who can't be told the truth. Shut up. His reply was so loud and sudden that I pulled away from the wall. You don't have any idea. No idea what you've done. Then tell me. Her voice changed. Pleading, understanding. Tell me what's going on. You can tell me, David. Cam, stop it. Stop changing the subject. What happened today in the village? Nothing, David. Nothing happened. We went to the local shop, but it was closed. Walked in you got split up. The four of you. Maria ran off. Was gone for 2 seconds. David, you know what she's like. She ran off, and Eve went after her. When she couldn't catch her, we split up and found her. Something clattered on the floor. Put them on, he said. There's a metal bar underneath the window. Around that. What? Are you serious? Do it, Lisa. I heard her moving, then the sound of a chain followed by a metallic snap. She started to speak again, but he was already leaving, locking the door behind him. He went to Maria, and a few minutes passed, voices too quiet to understand. I thought I heard Maria crying, but I couldn't make out any words, and I was too afraid to move closer to listen. Then more footsteps. Viv, my father in the hall. Can you hear me? Yes. My own voice wavered, coming out as a broken whisper. I need you to stand away from the door, back at the window, baby. Okay. I'm going to come in, but I need you to be standing there. You understand? Speak properly, Eve. Say you understand. This is important. I understand. Do it now, honey, okay? I scrambled over to the glass on all fours and put my back against the ledge. For a second, I saw the keyhole go dark and realized he was looking through it. Then the door unlocked, and he came in, gun still raised, and pointed at me. He had a pistol now as well. I caught a glimpse of it under his shirt, tucked into his belt. His other hand held a pair of handcuffs. He tossed them on the floor, and they skidded to my feet. The metal bar behind you, Eve, under the window. Put the cuffs around that bar, then clip them on your wrists. I nodded, picking them up and trying to do as he asked. You have to trust me, baby, okay? I've always protected you, haven't I? Always. I just need you to trust me. The handcuffs clicked into place, and I tightened them as he instructed. Then he backed out again, and was gone. Through the window, a full moon flashed between the clouds. My breath steamed the glass, and the metal of the cuffs cut cold into my skin. All I could do was wait. That house was unusual in many ways, not simply its isolation, or my father's fear of the place. Some of these things were small details I didn't pick up at first or thought nothing of, but not all. With the exception of my parents' room, every door was thick, heavy, and locked with a key. Theirs only differed in having no keyhole, just an iron latch on the inside. As for the windows, none could be opened from either side, not on any floor. Those metal bars we put the cuffs around could be found under every one of these windows. The basement was filled with dusty, battered books we weren't allowed to read, and moldy boxes we weren't allowed to look in. Then there was the attic. My brother had gotten a look inside before Dad sent him back downstairs. It was filled with weapons, Ryan had told me, old rifles, and pistols and crossbows, marked and faded with rust. And where every part of the house seemed to be wasting away, decaying like a carcass stripped to the bones. It felt like somewhere you hid from life, not somewhere you lived. There was a story there only my father knew, and it was a story he would never tell. When he returned, he went to my mother first. I shuffled as close to the wall as I could to listen. I've checked every part of this house to be certain, he was saying. No one else is in here. No one else could have got in. It's impossible. That's how this place was built. I know that as well as anyone. I survived here for 16 years. My mother's replies were quiet now, barely audible. You're sick, David. You need help. This, all of this, it's insane. What you are doing here, to your family, our girls, our son, Ryan, our son, David. This is insane. Whoever done it is in this house. Lisa, you understand. Do you get that? He went on as if he hadn't heard her. One of the four of us. It could be you, you see. It could be you who. His voice broke for a second. They will find out when the sun comes up. What are you talking about? Please, David. Please, this is... I couldn't have ever told you. You would have thought I was crazy. Left me, taken the kids. I tried to stay away from this place, but you wouldn't listen. Didn't leave me any choice, did you? I should have known better. I did know better, but I still made the wrong decision. I could hear the waver in his speech, grief and pain and desperation. David, they aren't like people think. He snapped suddenly, cutting her off. They are patient, easier to stop in some ways, much, much harder in others. They need to catch you alone. We are safe when we are inside, or together, you see. Should never be alone, especially not outside. He paused for a moment, and I pressed closer to the wall. The wounds don't even show, I know that. I remember, so you can't tell. Sometimes they don't even know what they are. Lisa, like two minds in one body, like a parasite inside, waiting for its chance. David, her words were calm, focused. Listen to me. I don't understand what you are saying. I can't understand, but we can get help. Please, whatever it is, whatever is wrong, we can fix it. Put down the gun. Let us go and call for help. We can go home. We can. No, it's too late for that. Too late. If you'd done what I asked, just done what I asked, it wouldn't have to be this way. But you never listened to me. Never. I heard movement, then the door. And lock again. He went to my sister's room, and a minute later came to me. He was pale and soaked in sweat, bottom lip cracked and bleeding. Viv, I have to do this, honey, okay? To keep you safe. To keep us all safe. I'm sorry, sweetheart. I'm so sorry. But we have to do this. They can hide away from crosses and questions, but the light always hurts them, at least a little, so then we will know. I think I must have slept. Eventually, the sounds of my father pacing the hall, the occasional shouts of my mother, they all faded. As the empty hours passed, I used my feet to pull down a cover and pull it around me as best I could. I thought about my brother. Was he hurt? Mom had wanted to call the police, call an ambulance. Why wouldn't Dad do that? What had happened? Ryan couldn't be dead, not my brother. He couldn't be. I watched the forest through the dark window, its glass now touched with frost. Watched for so long I didn't know if I was awake or in a dream. The wind sighed and moved and the shadows followed, and those dark shapes between the trees could have been figures, or branches, or nothing at all. Morning was close. As the hours passed, I thought I could hear a scraping sound from my mother's room, very faint, only growing louder. When my father went downstairs to the toilet, when he returned she began shouting on him again, loud and sudden. He ignored her for a minute, then, realizing she wasn't going to stop, strode to her room. I heard the lock turning, the creak of the hinges. Then it began, rapid footsteps followed by a cry, something striking flesh, and a person falling, or more than one, my mother cursing, and metal hitting the floor. I had sat up, every muscle tensed. I could hear her breathing heavily, moving around the room, lifting and dragging a heavy object. In seconds she was at my door, unlocking it and pulling it open, saying my name. She had the shotgun under her arm and keys in hand. She took off my cuffs, then we were moving together to my sister's room. As I waited for her to open the door, I looked into Ryan's room. My father was on the floor, blood flowing from an ugly wound on the side of his head. Beside him lay the metal bar from under the window frame. I could see the holes in the plaster where my mother had worked it out during the night. He groaned and I grabbed my mother's arm to warn her. Damn, she cursed as she stepped past me, then pulled over the door and locked my dad inside. A minute later we had my sister and were headed downstairs. As we reached the steps I heard my father calling our names and slamming against the door. We didn't stop, taking the stairs as fast as we could, clinging to each other. As we reached the ground floor my mother gave a sharp intake of breath and pulled us both in toward her, turning our faces away from whatever was there. Another slam came from above us, my father's cries echoing down the stairwell. Close your eyes for me, both of you. Hold on to me, and we will go together. Keep them closed. Don't open them till I say, okay. Don't look. We stumbled down those final few steps as she held us, guiding us forward. A crash from above made her flinch, but we kept moving. Go, go. Almost there. We were in the lounge when I looked again. I saw the hallway to the front door and broke into a run, letting go of my mother's arm. Almost there, I thought. I didn't realize how quiet it had gotten until I stopped. The sounds of movement, my mother's voice, the shouts from above, all gone. I turned and found myself alone. Mom, Maria. I started to walk back. I couldn't imagine going without them. Mom, I called again, and then I saw them, laying together on the ground, Mom pale and motionless on her back. Maria was crouched over her, face buried against her neck. My sister looked up at me and smiled, teeth and lips black with blood. There was a ragged open wound in our mom's throat. A gunshot rang out, a sudden thunder in the cold silence. Maria's body spun and fell across my mother, a thin trail of blood raining down across the dusty floor. I cried out, but I was frozen in place, too shaken and frightened to move. I could see my father swaying, blood and hair, and on his clothes, pistol in his hand still aimed at my sister's body. Then she started to get up. Her tiny frame rose in jerking, unnatural movements, more like a broken puppet than the girl I knew. She made it to her feet and turned towards him, her head hanging bloody and limp, but still smiling. "Daddy," he fired again, and the bullet struck her in the chest, knocking her back to the ground. I scrambled away into a corner, eyes closed and ears covered. Another shot, then another. For a few moments there was nothing but the dark and my heartbeat, flashing images I couldn't push away. When I opened my eyes and took my hands from my ears, it was over. My father walked towards the still bodies of his wife and youngest child, his feet dragged, arms hanging limp at his sides. The gun fell from his hand and clattered across the wooden floor. He seemed to collapse as he went, falling down to them, making only wordless sounds of loss. I watched him there in the weak light, shaking and weeping over them, over the ruins of his life, broken and emptied of everything but grief, a pain for which no words will suffice. I don't remember getting up, walking to him. I touched his arm, and he saw me at last, and pulled me close, the stench of sweat and blood and horror across us both, a wound that could never heal, only fester and burn. Outside the sun was rising. I loved my father, even there at the end. He tried so hard to protect us, to keep us safe. But when humans are afraid, they miss the simplest things. They make mistakes, like thinking my sister was the only one. Do you like old cartoons? If your first reaction is to talk about gummy bears or DuckTales, you're about 70 years off the mark. I'm talking before television, before color, back when just moving images on a screen was novel enough to draw a crowd. You felt this, you know this, there's something different about those old cartoons. A sense of depth, a sense of real momentum. And wait, it felt strange, didn't it? Beyond the dated references and comedy, the official story is lithographed backgrounds, shadow boxes, and a bunch of other film geek horse crap that 90% of people believe because they don't understand, and the other 10% don't care, because we are long past any of those techniques being useful. But ask yourself this, why did animation turn to trash sometime in the 50s? How does it make sense that we went from Popeye to Clutch Cargo, from images you could feel the depth of, to flat static, almost puppet-like cartoons? I'm Ethan Benson. I've proudly served in 2 world wars and begrudgingly stomped through a few more scuffles before my retirement from Uncle Sam's family business. I'm probably a contender for the oldest man alive. You'll never see me on the second last page of a newspaper though. Once I got away from the service, I did everything I could to live a life as small and out of the way as possible. I came to the conclusion last year that being able to get my own mail and wipe my own ass doesn't mean I still have a couple of decades left. This old war machine is falling apart, but before I do, I want to share some things with you. At this point, I have nothing to lose. Most people will think I'm just a crazy old bastard, and the rest, well, what are the G-men gonna do if they catch wind? Kill me. If they manage to find enough functioning nerves to torture, they've done a better job than my last 2 doctors, so good on them. What I'm saying is, I've got nothing to lose, but maybe I've got something to give. It was 1922, a few years after my life meant something, and a decade and a half before it would again. No wife, no kids, I wasn't a drifter, but not for lack of trying. Something kept bringing me back to a small town in Michigan, year after year though. Didn't take to being a soldier during peacetime, not as a young man anyway. I preferred to make my money here and there, see what my country had to offer. I sat eating my lunch on a park bench, watching folks without heads full of things they shouldn't have seen walk along blissfully unaware of the cruelty of their fellow man. I recognized the man that sat down beside me, but that didn't make me any less suspicious. There a war broke out I haven't heard of, I say, lighting up a cigarette. A man that sits beside me isn't a soldier. He's the kind of guy who goes by a last name he was assigned after training. Debriefed me a few times after some of the thickest stuff I've had to wade through, asked me questions I didn't understand, and expected answers I didn't have. No corporal, just an opportunity. The man I know as Mr. Thompson says, "What do you know of animation?" "Cartoons, kid stuff." I say, still looking forward, not making eye contact. Maybe, but it's big business, Hiram." Thompson says, "Ethan," I correct. "My mistake. Ethan, there is a man looking to make a legacy selling cartoons. This man has a friend powerful enough to make this happen. Someone who eats at the same tables my bosses do. He's looking to be the Henry Ford of what he does. He isn't the first, but he aims to be the biggest and best. He has his artists, he has his inventors, and now he needs a few men like yourself to make sure those guys can do their jobs." I don't like the way Thompson talks. He's taking up a lot of my time to say very little. Let's get to brass tacks here. Why in the Lord's name would a bunch of civilian doodlers need me? I say, standing up to throw away the remains of my lunch. Well, that's not something I can say to someone who hasn't signed on. But every man has a price, even for an unknown task. And I think I know what yours is. Thompson doesn't sound smug, just, sure. He was right, and I figured that if I ended up in some kind of sex crime, or aiming at folks that didn't deserve it, I could simply turn and walk away. Thompson was right, I wasn't. What in the hell was that thing? I say, pointing to a contraption worn by one of the crew. I assume it has to be a weapon of some form. It has a backpack full of humming electronics connected to what looks a little like the business end of a flamethrower, but instead of a nozzle, it's a massive square camera lens. Leroy, a black man in his early 30s, wears the thing like he's used to it, testing out the range of motion of the rig. As he answers me, "The most advanced rotoscope money can buy. This little darling has hours of recording time and lets us edit the raw footage within a couple hours, if the place is interesting enough." Pierre, the director, says. He's a rat-like, cruel-looking little man, without a hint of French accent, despite his claims to have lived there most of his life. Among the half-dozen crew there are a couple of chuckles, but most silently go about checking film gear that I can't even guess to the function of. We are kidding ourselves up in a dark warehouse, getting ready to be driven in the back of what looks like a paddy wagon. Thompson watches us all. I hate his eyes, always scrutinizing, but not showing a damn hint of what the man was thinking. Ezekiel Greenberg, biologist, a man with thick glasses and greased down, parted hair, says, offering his hand. "The hell is that?" I say, shaking his hand. He has a grip like wet bread. "Someone who studies living things. A man of science." Ezekiel clarifies. "Shalamzik, why do we need someone like that for making a cartoon?" I ask. "Everyone," Thompson says, loud enough to catch our attention. He motions us over. "Other than going to some trash hole close 4 hours away, do we get to know what we're doing now?" A tall, olive-skinned woman says. Sylvia was her name. A few trinkets hang from her wrist, an eclectic combination of various religious symbols. I'd assume that was clear. Pierre and Leroy will be collecting footage. Ezekiel will be taking notes, and the rest of you will be ensuring this happens in a safe fashion. You need to understand, everything from the wildlife to the environment itself is going to be hostile toward you. This place isn't somewhere you get by accident, and it's not a place man was meant to be. You will be encountering threats of a physical, mental, and even possibly spiritual nature. Thompson starts. The last member of the squad was a tall, square-jawed man named Chauncey. Looks like a fighter, but more likely someone that got his scars in a back alley, not a battlefield. He wears a white shirt, black suspenders, and one of those pork pie hats the Brits seem to like. Spiritual, the tall man scoffs, a smirk cracking his pale, scarred face. Thompson shrugs. "If you believe in that kind of thing anyway. Our client is looking for a great reward. You all are being compensated for the great risk. Anything else, well, you'll understand when you arrive. Speed and discretion are the order of the day, people." We barely fit ourselves in the cramped van, and after what I put it, somewhere around 6 hours of ass-destroying potholes and rough terrain, we arrive. We exit the paddy wagon and enter what seems to be a large cave. It's dim, but not dark. About a half-click ahead of us is daylight. Thompson has me running light, some kind of Dane submachine gun, a Thompson pistol, and a couple of smoke grenades. Chauncey now wears a cargo vest, hiking boots, and sports nothing more warlike than a large, curved-handled knife. As we approach the exit of the cave, my mind conjured up all kinds of things, some mundane, some paranormal, all horrifying. But what I saw when we left the safety of the damp rock made all of those look like pleasant daydreams. The reek hit me first, a low, deep smell of industrial waste and rot, chemical tang, and fetid miasma trying to outdo each other for the title of world's most offensive odor. Then, my brain struggled to make sense of the sheer amount of motion I was seeing. I'm going to call where we found ourselves a forest. But goddamn, that's only because there is no other word I can think of that would fit the bill. Like calling a porcupine a thumbtack, really. All around us were tall, whip-like, dirty, gray, not quite wooden things. Each bounced and swayed as if dancing to the beat of some song we couldn't hear. It seemed impossible. The sheer weight of the things should be tearing apart the hard-packed, red-tinted soil. Ezekiel, despite looking like a Poindexter, runs fearlessly over to one of the trees. He scratches at it with a small pocket knife and pushes it with his hand. It's rock solid, he says, having to duck to avoid an especially low sway. That's great, Zeke, but get the hell away from it, I say, doing my best drill sergeant impression. He actually takes a couple seconds to mull it over before getting back with the group. Leroy, get about 15 minutes of this for B-roll, Pierre demands. Leroy sighs, and the machine he's lugging starts to hum as he aims it around us. Chauncey pulls out a map. I see the mountain, a body of water, in the forest. We have about a 2-kilometer hike before we get to the river. I suggest making as little noise as possible as we do so, the scarred man says, glowering at Pierre. You've been here before? I ask. I've been to every jungle on Earth, this being the only exception. Wiggly trees or not, it's no more dangerous than any of them, Chauncey answers. The forest is full of things. If I described them all, we'd be here all night. But each and every one of them seems like an attempt or a mockery of something natural. Fleshy rocks that seem to be grinning or scowling at the right angle. Four-legged deer-like things with massive human eyes and bobbing, tiny heads. Or even small flitting insects that seem to whisper as they buzz by. The place feels weird, menacing, and in a way I can't describe. Purpose-built. My heart pounds and I grip the SMG. I don't like the look of the wildlife. Beyond the obvious, they seem smart. There's a hint of understanding behind every twisted, manic creature's eyes. I notice Sylvia taking something from a small, brass container and dropping it on the ground every so often. Breadcrumbs, I think the big guy is here to find our way back, I say, trying to start a conversation to keep my mind off of this nightmare. The ashes of a holy man, she says. Roma, I'm guessing, I say, trying to place her accent. Gypsy, and proud of it, she says, spitting on the ground. That's for the Roma. I chuckle, think that stuff is going to keep us safe. I ask as something in the tree line catches my eye. Let's hope we don't have to find out. I like her answer, but not the implication. I start to wonder why I'm feeling seasick, but Leroy brings the topic up first. There's no horizon, he says, fearfully, and the man isn't wrong. As the forest begins to thin, there is no end in sight, no curve at which you just can't see. I can make out structures, water and islands for what must be hundreds of kilometers away. Ezekiel seems enraptured. This place, it can't exist, he says, taking notes. As we walk, this is just an impossibility. Even if there were a place, flat enough, where could it be? We are seeing sun, so we can't be underground. Completely fascinating. I hate the bookworm's glee, but he isn't wrong. It takes us almost until the tree line to notice the bodies. They are entwined with the roots of the dancing, swaying, tree-like things, looking half-eaten, faces frozen for eternity or slightly twitching in their last moments of life. Obviously, we are going to need to edit those out, Pierre says. His callousness makes me want to break his jaw. People live here, I say, half to myself. These people were either brought here or came here. Chauncey says, matter-of-factly, wherever we are, it's far away from the States. I doubt if there were folks who called this place home, they'd be wearing dungarees and skirts we've all seen at Woolworths. My head is on a swivel as we hit the tree line, finally getting a clear view of the massive body of murky, green water and the floating carnival of horror it held. The ships had no sense of conformity, each a unique, impossible barge of rotten wood, rusted steel, and what appeared to be worked human remains. We could have chose any number of the hundreds floating by. Each was its own impossibly buoyant war crime. But Pierre pointed out one that bore a slight resemblance to an old-fashioned steamboat if you squinted real hard. Horse-toothed pipes belched thick, almost in-kai smoke from its roof. They snap and fight with each other like stray dogs. At its helm was a squat, pug-faced, almost goblinoid thing. Its skin was shadow black, with weeping gray sores. It wore gore-stained overalls cut into short pants. In front of it is a breaking wheel, some poor soul bound to it, screaming as the maniac creature twists the torture implement, sending the barge on a crazy, zigzagging journey. Pierre looks rapt, swatting Leroy in the arm and pointing. Say what you will about my reasons for signing up. Watching this bastard get his jollies watching someone be slowly torn apart makes my trigger finger itch. Behind the first creature comes a second, a massive, flesh mountain of a thing, clad in a robe of sorts, stitched together from what must be the outfits of a dozen people. The interaction is brutal, half fight, half conversation. But as the massive one takes the wheel, we notice none of the horrific blows caused any kind of lasting harm. Think your pistols and knives will keep us safe, Sylvia says with a smirk. She pats a black velvet bag at her side. If we just get the footage and get out, we won't need to be kept safe, Chauncey says. We slowly creep along the tree line following the barge. Its destination seems to be a lawn. Dock. Its wood is pale and worked. Its timber sways slightly. The ship pulls up, and a strange device, some kind of harness on an almost gallows-like structure, swings toward the barge of its own accord. The two fiends open a hatch in the deck and drag forth something no horror of war before or since could match. Two people, torn apart and crudely stitched together into four-legged, almost bovine abomination. This wasn't some Frankenstein's monster, some marvel of a mad mind. No, as it was dragged and slammed into the harness, it became crystal clear that this was just two poor folks, ripped apart and jammed together, living their final moments, racked in pain, confused, and crippled. Both things stand covered in gore, grinning, inflicting damage upon each other in celebration of whatever the hell they just did. The two corpses twist and scream as the harness slides down the dock with a wooden grating noise. Chauncey is trying to look unfazed. Ezekiel looks about 2 seconds away from a heart attack. I close my eyes, trying to find some sense of calm, some sense of reality in this mess. We need to go, now, Sylvia says. I open my eyes and see why. Both of the things, 2, maybe 3 kilometers away, seem to be staring directly at us. Stay calm, they could be looking at anything, Chauncey says. The small, almost rodent-like one waves. Pierre tries to protest, but before he can get started, I slam the butt of the SMG into the bridge of his nose. His demands turn to a scream as I grab him and shove the insufferable little prick back the way we came. We sprint. The forest around us begins to go mad with motion. Behind us, a deafening roar of water and rage. I can't help but look. The ship raises itself on tubular, pulsing legs, hundreds of meters long. It bears a giant, idiot grin, its maw square-toothed, and flanked by massive doll-like eyes. The creatures aboard plant instruments constructed of flesh and bone, the racket still audible over the displaced water, and supernatural rage. As we sprint toward the mouth of the cave, we hear other, smaller noises all around us. I see the rat-like, evil little prick turn around, and the look on his face tells me he hasn't learned his lesson. I grab a fistful of shirt and intend to put him out and sling the half a man over my shoulder. When I do, he shoves something in my face. I know what it is and let go of the evil little manlet. There is charge in the rotoscope capable of destroying everything within 200 feet. Leroy, get me footage of that thing. We did not come here to fail. Pierre grins as he talks. Leroy listens. The sounds around us get closer. Why? Just answer me that, I say. Because I believe in Mr. D. I believe in his vision, and if that costs me my life, so be it, is his reply. The little prick looks like a cult member. Chauncey takes off his vest, drawing a massive kukri. Sylvia begins to take items out of her bag and begins to recite something in a language I've never heard. A dozen or so things come out of the forest, no bigger than a dog, all almost perfect clones of the small, rodent-like thing on the ship. They are dressed in motley, each seeming to be a different profession. One looks like a doctor, another a dock worker, a third might be a waiter or usher. They swarm the massive man, but in an instant I can tell the guy is used to dealing with dangerous creatures. He moves and stabs with his knife, never getting too close. After a few seconds, we see that the small creatures are nowhere near as resilient as the one on the barge. I try to get an angle for a shot, but I don't feel confident I could do it without hitting Chauncey, but he doesn't seem to need the help. Tiny, onyx, pock-filled limbs fly, screaming goblin-like creatures hit the dirt. Sylvia's chant reaches a crescendo. I feel pressure. Objects she's placed around her begin to rattle. The ship is close now, maybe a half kilometer away, and closing fast, faster than Chauncey's dodge. The big man stumbles, a piece missing from the back of his thigh. Before he can regain his stance, 2, then 3 of the things are on him. They make short work of him once he hits the ground. A man is gutted like a trout in seconds. Stay close, Sylvia says. She stands with her eyes closed, sweat starting to bead on her brow. More footage. Pierre screams. Leroy says something to him in French. All I made out was murd. We stand next to Sylvia as the things start to close in. The boat looms like the face of God himself, but something is keeping this unholy horde about 20 feet from us. I fire a burst at the boat. I might as well have spit at it. Another at the crowd of cloned rats, but the move on before the rounds hit. Sylvia begins to slowly walk backward, the monsters advancing with her pace. How long can you keep this up? I ask. I don't know, less if I have to keep talking. She says curtly, the pace is slow, but we can't be more than 100 meters from the mouth of the cave. Sylvia stumbles for a moment. The pressure around us begins to lighten. She sweeps one arm out, trying to regain balance. I saw nothing but a blur. Then in an instant Sylvia's arm was pierced by the tip of one of the tree-like thing's branches. She's dragged into the air, screaming, blood from her arm falling like rain. I try shooting the branch, sparks, noise, and nothing more. The horde takes its time, closing in like nightfall. I change magazines. What are we going to do? Ezekiel screams. I take in a deep breath, line up my target, and hope my sharpshooting skills aren't too rusty. The burst severs her arm. I drop the weapon, doing my best to cushion her fall. 2 ribs crack. I scream as we hit the ground. Zeke, to his credit, begins to dress the wound immediately. Judging by the small medical kit he had on him, he probably has enough skill to do the job well enough till we can find a hospital. This is no monster Hiram, Sylvia says, pain making her words clipped. So we're screwed, I say, assuming the obvious. I have no word or command that will sway them. They may accept a sacrifice, she says. I hesitate. Some people need killing. That's not what bothers me. But looking at these things, these impossible, powerful things, I understand what I'm doing. I'm not just killing a man. I'm making a sacrifice to things that are either demons or close enough to it. It doesn't matter. But if I don't, Pierre, I'm going to make you an offer. We duke it out. Whichever one of us is left standing gets to walk away. I say, standing. I'll end us all before I let you lay a hand on me. A smug little asshole says, brandishing the detonator. My knife isn't as big as Chauncey's, but it's sharp and small enough to conceal up a sleeve. The detonator falls as the blade severs the tendons in Pierre's wrist. He tries to come at me. I let him. For a few seconds, I take his blows. My lip splits. A cracked rib pulses with pain. Then I aim the pistol downward. It turns his kneecap into a dripping rose of bone and flesh. I turn to face the horde. The barge itself lowers its body, staring at us from 2 feet away. Rank seawater breath hits us like a mortar. As I talk, Sylvia repeats what I say in that same landless language. He's yours. I, Hiram Benson, give you this man. In exchange, we leave, I say, trying to make eye contact with the demonic construct. I felt something then, like a bloom of sadness deep inside of my brain. A cold, dim spot that never really went away. Turn around, slowly, Sylvia says, putting one arm around my shoulders. We make it back to the cave, and to that same warehouse, leaving parts of our bodies, and likely souls, behind. You looking for a happy ending? Well, we all got paid, and for what it's worth, Sylvia made it through real surgery. But the thing is, that ain't the end. Now, here is where you need to worry. Those things we so ignorantly recorded, those things that have a part of my soul, they were more than we knew. Their danger wasn't limited to claws and teeth. See, some of them, they can live in images. A piece of themselves stays in every copy. And kids, there are a lot of copies. Mr. D and others sent plenty of teens just like mine into those places, layered a happy face over the frantic evil, and put them in homes, theaters, and schools across the world. In fact, I'd bet a lot of you have 1 or 2 sitting around right now. A DVD bought in a bargain bin, maybe a video you watched on YouTube. You've felt it, you've seen it, now you understand it. My advice, just let these things die. Let these macabre melodies get lost in time. Don't go searching old cartoons to see if you can catch a glimpse, an untouched frame of pure evil. Now, I've never been one to turn down a paycheck, and if you folks need any more lessons from an old man who might not see summer, let me know down in the comments. Otherwise, I hope you are the first generation to actually listen to your elders. I remember the first time I heard about the plague ship. I had a friend named Shannon who, despite the name, was a guy. Not just any guy, though. He was a nerdy, overweight, socially awkward guy who happened to be the son of a state senator. Both Shannon and I had recently graduated high school, and we wanted a trip to remember it by. He didn't really have a lot of friends besides me, so he would often throw ideas at me for a party or a trip. Seeing as I sold weed back in high school, I had plenty of friends, or at least people who would hang around and call themselves friends. How about the plague ship? Shannon asked me through a mouthful of home fries as I sat in a diner booth across from him. He ordered enough food for 3 people, including chicken steaks and turkey pot pies and bacon, and to my growing horror, he had eaten all of it in a single sitting. I had a coffee and a bagel. I sat there, wondering how he didn't throw up. The plague what? I said, raising an eyebrow. What's that? Some video game? Shannon laughed, a high-pitched, womanly sound that caused the rolls of fat on his neck to jiggle and dance. Oh, no, he said, a video game. Definitely not. This is real, man. My dad told me about it, and I did a little research. Now I was intrigued. I leaned closer across the table, feeling the wispy heat from the coffee rising towards my face. Your dad knows about it, huh? Tell me everything you know. And he did, though it wasn't much. According to rumors his father had heard, the Coast Guard, police boats, and fishermen in the area kept encountering an unknown vessel. From eyewitness accounts, it looked ancient and battered. The staves of the hull had rotten holes covered with black mold. The mold sent out tendrils that seemed to grasp and flex across the outside of the ship like clenching fingers. The sails of the boat had coarse, black stitches running in irregular square patches up and down it. A strange, white kind of leather composed the sails, which witnesses claimed looked like human skin. Dozens of skulls tied to ropes jiggled from the masthead, cracking into each other with hollow smacks like wind chimes from hell. And at the top of the masthead, like the angel on a Christmas tree, a crucified, decaying body hung, silver nails biting deeply into its wrists and ankles to secure it forever to the post. That sounds like an urban legend, I said, rolling my eyes. That's like all those legends about the Mary Celeste still roaming the seas with her ghost sailors. But that's not all, Shannon said, lowering his voice into a faux spooky, campfire tone. His magnified eyes behind his glasses looked owlish, roaming around the diner as if looking for something, and not finding it. There were deaths and disappearances. The people who saw the ship claimed that it has walking corpses, men with slit throats, and pale, waterlogged skin who abduct anyone who sees the ship. One guy apparently escaped by shooting his captor and jumping overboard. The Coast Guard vessel ended up finding him near the flaming ruins of his boat a few hours later. He said they killed everyone else in horrible ways, skinning them, crucifying them, keel-hauling them, everything. He said they burned his wife alive on the ship. What does keel-hauling mean? I asked. He shook his head. You really don't want to know. It's like the sailors' version of skinning, I guess, using sharp barnacles on the side of the ship. They strip the person naked, and then drag the person's back up and down over the edges of the shells, and like hundreds of little razor blades, they just scrape into the flesh. He shuddered. I don't know who thinks up these punishments. I thought about his idea of going out to find this mysterious ghost ship. I had no doubt in my mind that the entire story was probably a load of BS, but it would be fun to get out on the ocean. Okay, let's do it, I said, grinning. We should get a few people together and go out and find this cursed ship. I'm sure it will be a trip worth remembering. We had asked around in our circle of friends and found a few who knew about boats and sailing. Travis, a friend of mine who towered over the rest of us and who constantly smelled like weed, told me his dad had been in the Navy and had taught him all sorts of useless crap about boating. He even told us his dad had a boat in the ocean port not too far from where all the activity with the supposed ghost ship had been spotted, and that he would let him use it if we filled it with gas, and gave his father a few $100 for wear and tear. Seeing as most boat rental agencies charged anywhere from $200 to $700 an hour around my area, I was instantly on board with the idea, paying much less. And that's how I found myself on a white, sparkling cabin cruiser with Shannon, Travis, and 2 other friends who volunteered to come on the trip, a pair of identical twin girls I knew named Leslie and Sadie. The name of the boat shone on the side in bright silver letters, the Sea Lady. A couple weeks after Shannon had first proposed the idea, we set off a couple hours before sunset, deciding to do some night boating and see the endless expanse of the Atlantic under the dark summer sky. And if we came across the ghost ship, so much the better, but I wasn't holding my breath. We set off from the port, the exclamations of multiple excited voices reverberating over the open water. The cabin cruiser was slightly crowded with 5 people, but it wasn't too bad. I had brought a couple of ounces of magic mushrooms and quite a bit of cannabis edibles, and flour. Some of the others had brought their own stuff, mostly booze. I decided to wait to pass out the mushrooms. If we were all tripping, it might get hard to boat, and I didn't want to end up stranded in the ocean waiting to come down. I went around and gave some of the weed gummies out to everyone, though, and people pulled out beer and started drinking. Someone gave me a bottle of Spaten. "This is going to be so awesome," Shannon said, his huge eyes gleaming with excitement behind his glasses. His irises looked red, his eyes half closed. I could tell he didn't usually eat edibles. Someone had turned on the radio, and Led Zeppelin echoed across the endless ocean. The sun had started to set, red streaks setting out across the sky. "You know," Travis said, coming up to us, "there's an old sailor's legend that red streaks at sunset are good luck. Red streaks at sunrise are bad luck. Apparently, scientists found out that it's true. A bloody sunrise sometimes means a storm is coming, and with most winds going in a westerly direction." "Yeah, I don't really care," I said. A shark's fin broke the water nearby, circling the boat. It snapped at something under the dark surface, and a cloud of bright red blood rose up, expanding like smoke through the shadowy water. I didn't know we had sharks around here. Leslie and Sadie had joined us. They were both thin with eyes, so pale blue they looked almost colorless. Dirty blonde hair ran down their backs. They were not, thankfully, dressed identically, because I would have found that somewhat creepy. Leslie had some expensive designer clothing, while Sadie wore a shirt for some heavy metal band called Samuel. I ended up passing out some mushrooms to everyone soon after. Shannon said he didn't want any, but everyone else ate a handful. I chewed the dried, fibrous stalks with an expression of disgust, choking it down with a bottle of Coke. "There are sharks everywhere," Travis said, staring out at the fin splicing the water as it receded into the distance. "They're nature's alpha predators. They almost never get cancer, and they can keep regrowing their teeth. When they lose them, their teeth actually face inwards, like barbs that grab the prey and keep it from escaping or thrashing around too much." Shannon piloted the boat, driving like an old lady across the open expanse of ocean. I saw the last red rays of the sun disappearing over the horizon, like drops of blood washed away in the rain. "It's empty out here," Sadie said, taking a sip from her beer, as she looked up at the night sky. "And you can see all the stars. There are no clouds. They're all so bright out here. Is it normal to not see any other boats?" I asked Travis. He shrugged. "I guess. I don't usually come out at nighttime, though. My dad took me fishing at night a few times when I was a kid, and I still remember seeing Coast Guard and police boats occasionally, though," Travis said. As I stared at him, I realized his face appeared to be changing colors, growing orange and red hues. I looked around, confused. On the horizon, I saw a boat on fire. Long fingers of flame reached upwards towards the sky, sending out billowing black columns of choking smoke. The sky became covered with an expanding dark cloud that blotted out the stars and the moon. "Jesus Christ," Leslie shouted, breaking my trance. "What if there's people on there?" "Then they're probably dead," Travis said blankly, seemingly entranced by the flickering, dancing fire on the seemingly infinite expanse of shadowy water. "But maybe people jumped out before it spread. Maybe they're just over there, treading water and waiting for help. We need to go check it out." Shannon had stopped the boat and got up clumsily from the seat, tripping and falling over a coiled rope. I helped him up. "Can't we call the Coast Guard for help?" Sadie asked. Travis jumped up and ran towards the driver's seat. He twisted some dials until he grunted with satisfaction, then depressed the speaker's button and began shouting into it. "Mayday, mayday, mayday. This is the Sea Lady. Our position is..." He looked down at an electronic compass and rattled off a list of coordinates. "We have spotted a burning ship nearby. We don't know if there are any survivors. Please send rescue as soon as possible." He repeated the message a couple times, but I heard no response. A chill ran down my spine. As I waited in the silence, only the static hissing of the speaker and the rhythmic splashing of the waves breaking it. I thought I might have heard garbled fragments of random words in the white noise, but it might have been my imagination, or perhaps an effect of the psilocybin. Travis started to pilot the ship over towards the burning wreckage, driving much faster than Shannon had. The waves raced past us, topped with white foamy caps. The salty air seemed to revive me, but I also noticed the first rising vibes of the mushrooms starting to take over. I felt anxious, my chest tight. I didn't want to potentially see burnt and blackened bodies right now. The stars seemed to dance in circling patterns of colorful light. I saw Mars overhead, looking down on us like a bleeding eye. Venus seemed to have spikes of white light spiraling around its bright center. Travis rapidly decelerated, throwing me forwards. I realized I had gotten lost in a trance for a little bit. I looked around nervously, seeing that we were almost at the burning craft. The fire seemed to have died down somewhat, though more black smoke than before obscured our view. It hovered over the water and blotted out the sky like some great cosmic dragon. As it rose high above us, hanging off the side of the deck, I saw the burnt body of a person. Whether male or female, I could no longer tell. It didn't look like much more than charcoal at this point, the blackened arms still reaching over the rails, as if asking for help. Travis continued to repeat his message. On the radio, I couldn't tell if the transmission was getting through or not, but I was not hopeful. Only garbled fragments of words came through every few minutes, and we couldn't tell who it was or what they were saying. It might have just been picking up random signals from different sources for all we knew. We had no idea if help was on the way. "Oh my God," Leslie said, putting her hand over her mouth as she noticed the body laying over the railing. The ship looked like a fishing vessel, significantly longer than our cabin cruiser. It still had a net trailing behind its shattered, burning carcass. "I'm going to circle it slowly," Travis yelled from his seat at the controls. "Look for anyone swimming or treading water in the area. Look for any signs of life jackets or anything, if there are survivors." But he never got to finish the thought. From a distance, I heard water splashing as something large spliced through the rippling waves. I saw a huge, black silhouette moving in our direction. Rotten boards and an impaled body posed as a figurehead broke through the clouds of black smoke. The haze parted, and in that moment, I saw a ship that looked straight out of a nightmare. The keel rose out of the water like a black scab. The sails caught the wind, and it was exactly as Shannon had told me. Dark, ugly stitches ran across the massive sails, which looked to be made of a strange kind of white leather the exact hue of human skin. Hundreds of human skulls hung from chains, and ropes attached to the mastheads, smashing against each other with dull cracking sounds. I saw strips of rotting flesh still attached to some writhing tendrils of something dark brown and alive wrapped around the hull, flexing and relaxing like enormous muscles. I saw many holes eaten into the keel and the hull, but the strange fungus, or whatever it was, covered them in horizontal strips. A sickening figurehead stuck out the front of the ship. I saw a rotting female body impaled through the stomach with a sharp metal spear. The bloody point emerged from her mouth, her blue lips frozen in an eternal scream. The decomposing flesh hung off in strips, waving in the breeze like some grotesque flag. Her eyes stared blankly, still open. Cloudy death cataracts covered them, giving them a faded look. Human silhouettes gazed over the sides of the craft at us. I looked up and met the white, glistening eyes of one as it stared blankly down. I immediately wished I hadn't. It had white, mirrored eyes like a raccoon caught in the headlights of a car. I saw colorless gray skin hanging loose off the bones. Some of them had deep slash marks on their throats or faces, while others had holes blown in their stomachs and chests. They all had weapons in their hands and stood as still as statues, grinning down at us as the ship sped towards the Sea Lady. "Get us away, Travis," Sadie screamed, running over to where Travis sat in the cockpit, sweating heavily despite the fierce ocean wind. Travis' one diamond earring sparkled and glistened as he furiously pushed the boat towards its upper limit. Shannon walked over to my side, staring up at me with huge eyes. His fat, soft body quivered with terror. "I can't believe it's real," Shannon whispered. The plague ship drew nearer, moving in a blur through the smoke. The engine whined and shrieked as Travis pushed the Sea Lady to its upper limit. But as I looked back, the ship seemed to loom larger, and I thought of the shark's fin we had seen racing across the ocean towards some smaller fish. Now we were the fish, and I knew without a doubt that the shark had found us. The ship smashed into the Sea Lady with a shrieking of tearing metal. It felt like an earthquake under my feet. I got thrown violently across the deck, smashing my face into the railing. I saw a violent explosion of colors in my vision, purples and blacks and dark reds flowing down and dripping in kaleidoscopic tunnels. The mushrooms had fully kicked in. A rising sense of total panic shook my soul. Travis was standing next to me, blood dripping from his nose. He hauled me up to my feet. He started screaming something in my ear, but all I could hear was hundreds of gallons of water rushing into the boat. Behind that, the ticking of the engine, like some massive mechanical heart undergoing cardiac arrest. Finally, the engine died with a loud groan. The plague ship had turned and begun to circle back to where our boat stood in the water, as stranded as a shipwrecked sailor. Travis furiously tried to get the engine started again, but I heard noises like flooding, and random sputters and hiccups from the boat. "Oh my god, we're going to die here, aren't we?" Leslie asked, crying into her hands. Sadie rolled her eyes. "Screw that," she said, going over to Travis. "What do we have for weapons here?" I admired her chutzpah and bravery. Compared to her sister, she seemed like some mythical Valkyrie. Leslie continued to whimper into her hands. Both of them had eaten a sizable dose of magic mushrooms, probably at least 4 grams. Sadie's pupils were the size of quarters, as Travis reached into a compartment and pulled out some fishing gear. After moving aside some lines and boxes of tackle, he found a couple filleting knives. Their blades gleamed, sharp and wicked in the dim starlight. "Here," Travis said, handing one to Sadie. Shannon waddled over, his shorts tight around his chubby legs. After hesitating a moment, Travis gave a knife to Shannon. "What am I supposed to use?" I asked. Travis grinned and pulled out a flare gun. I looked at it, confused. What the hell am I supposed to do with this? This isn't the movies. I'm not even sure a flare gun can hurt someone. "This is a pretty heavy flare, man," Travis said. A heavy rope came whipping down between us, making me jump. I looked up and saw the plague ship moving slowly overhead. More ropes were thrown down, and within seconds, the first of the damned vessel's shock troopers slid down. The first creature down was a man who towered over all of us, even Travis, who was well over 6 feet tall. My friends stood around with huge pupils and staring eyes. Leslie refused to look at the loose, gray skin on the abomination's face. She continued to whimper and moan like a kicked dog. I could smell sulfur, rust, and salt water oozing from the creature's mouth, along with undertones of sickly, decaying flesh. As the 5 grams of mushrooms I had eaten continued to hit me in waves, I could see the colors of the rotten odors emanating from the abomination. Blasts of cancerous black mixed with the dark red of clotted blood in my vision, forming an aura around the creature that sizzled and popped. His body looked waterlogged and swollen. Purple and black veins bulged against his soft, wet flesh. He raised a hand that reminded me of a dead, desiccated starfish. His fingers curled. I saw the nails had turned black and cracked. They used dark pus that dripped down the creature's hands in searching rivulets. "Where is the tribute?" the creature hissed in a drowning, gurgling voice. Salt water and blood bubbled from his cyanotic lips. I could hear my heart in my ears, slamming repeatedly against the cage of bones that held it, as if trying to escape from the death it knew was so near. I held the flare gun in my right hand. I now looked down at it, frowning. It looked like a useless heap of junk in my hand. More of the abominations landed on the sea lady, surrounding us. The creature who had spoken grinned at us, his face seemingly frozen into a lunatic death mask. "The tribute," the creature continued to demand. I shook my head. Travis and Sadie stood by my sides. "We don't know what you're talking about," Sadie screamed. "Just leave us alone." The creature who had spoken shook his head like a disappointed father, the rictus grin still plastered across his nightmarish face. Without another word, he raised his hand. I noticed a smell like a match being struck. The creature's hand erupted into flame. Still smiling at me, it knelt down and touched the sea lady. Fire jumped from its hand onto the boat, as if it were pumping napalm out of its fingers. Scorching lines of the rising inferno ate into the wood of the boat within seconds. I heard screaming, as if from very far away. Then I realized it was my own voice screaming. The creatures from the ship had surrounded us. With a shriek of mortal terror and bloodlust, Sadie ran forwards. At the last second, her long sleeve pulled itself up on her arm. I saw the wicked blade of the filleting knife grasp tightly in her clenched fist. She slammed the blade into the monster, who continued to pump out fire from his inhuman body. It pierced through his faded cataract eye and into his skull. He froze, the smile evaporating from his face like mist under the summer sun. Sadie continued to stare forwards in horror. She realized the extent of her mistake immediately. The creature plucked the knife out of its face. The entire sickly, clouded eye came with it, dripping small, black worms and squirming larvae onto the sea lady. Then it wrapped its arms around Sadie and lit her on fire. She spun with the monster as if in a dance of death, the smoke and ashes from their burning bodies mixing and rising up towards the smoke-clouded sky. Others had started to take the rest of us. I saw one dragging a shell-shocked Leslie towards the rope. She had stopped crying and now stared blankly ahead. I felt cold hands grip my back. The skin felt loose and soggy on the bones, like worms drowned after a rainstorm. I spun, raising the flare gun and firing point blank into whatever abomination attacked me. A man with a giant exit wound in the front of his chest stood there. I could see the decaying black heart beating through the wound. Tiny worms and squirming maggots ate the rough patches of torn flesh around the circumference. The flare shot into his grinning, open mouth. I saw his head lit up like a jack-o'-lantern. As his skull exploded, he fell limply to the side, the long tongues of flame licking his nearly headless body now. Without a moment of hesitation, I pushed through the opening I had created and jumped overboard. Fire blackened my clothes, and I felt an intense heat against my skin. Within seconds, though, the cooling water of the ocean had taken over. Without looking back, I began to swim away, hiding around the keel and moving to the other side to confuse any potential pursuers. But no undead sailors jumped into the water. I saw the Sea Lady sink. As the plague ship started off with its new load of cargo, I caught the last glimpse of my friends. They had taken Leslie and keel-hauled her. I saw her eyes go wide as the ropes bit deeply into her ankles and wrists. She screamed in agony as flesh peeled like warm butter from her back when the undead sailors ran her up and down over the barnacles. It turned the water a bright red underneath. Another sailor pulled off the rotting figurehead from the front of the plague ship. Even though the impaled woman had clearly been dead for a long time, when they began to lift her body off the sharp stake, her lips twitched and her eyes fluttered. Her hand clenched into a fist. The burnt figure of Sadie looked down over the side of the ship, dripping blood and yellowish pus into the salty water far below. She couldn't have been alive, yet she stood there. And as the ship pulled off, I thought I saw her destroyed, blackened hand waving to me. I treaded water and continued to swim around the remnants of the Sea Lady, not knowing what I would do. The mushrooms continued to make me wonder whether this was all really happening, or whether maybe I would wake up in some sensory deprivation tank somewhere, saying, "Damn, that was an intense trip." But I could tell it was very real when the first fins of the sharks broke the surface of the water, circling me. They must have smelled the blood from the torture and murder of my friends. Perhaps when Leslie's blood filled the water, it had drawn them from far away. But regardless, they were here now, and they were very hungry. I clung to a piece of debris from the Sea Lady. The last remnants of its collapsing frame were quickly disappearing, sending opaque clouds of suffocating smoke all over the water. A shark's fin came within feet of me. I tried kicking at it, but it just circled. And then I heard the roaring of an engine. A spotlight broke through the shadows. I looked up quickly, seeing a Coast Guard vessel. I started screaming at the top of my lungs. One of the men heard me. The ship drew near, but more sharks had started to circle. One came in a straight line at me, shrieking. I tried to punch and kick at it, but with a cold, burning pain, I felt its teeth sink deeply into my leg. By that point, the Coast Guard had reached me. The engines had sent some of the sharks away, yet the one on my foot had me tightly in its grip. It shook its head like a dog with a toy. I felt bones splinter and saw a cloud of blood fill the water. My foot went numb. I tried to move it, but I couldn't. A shot rang out. I saw a bullet smash into the body of the shark. It released my mutilated leg, swimming off, leaving a cloud of blood in its wake. The Coast Guard men pulled me up. As I got over the edge of the railing, I looked down and realized my right foot was totally gone. Nietzsche once said, "I am the last man. Nobody talks to me as myself, and my voice comes to me like that of a dying person." I think all those who have seen far enough have felt the same desolation, the sense of echoes fading into the darkness of the mind, the crushing feeling of the serpent eating its own tail. But on the plague ship, it was different. The cycle no longer revolved behind the veil. For those who are eternally trapped there, death has no hold. Back in 2012, I believe I stopped the apocalypse. I remember staring down at the endless hole in the desert with wonder and awe. It seemed to go on forever. A lifelong friend of mine named Bear stood by my side. He scanned the ground and found a large, smooth rock. It must have weighed at least 60 pounds. He rolled it over to the edge of the seemingly infinite void and let it drop. I heard the stone clatter against the walls, smashing against one side and releasing a rush of small pebbles and clods of dirt. They soared downwards with the rock, reminding me of the sands in an eternal hourglass. "Look, there's stairs," Bear's girlfriend Stephanie said, pointing a freshly painted red nail at the steps. They looked hewn from solid rock and spiraled down into the darkness far below. Stephanie tilted her head slightly to the side, moving locks of dirty blonde hair away from her eyes. Her appearance reminded me of Emma Stone, and though nearly 25, she still looked like a teenager. We stood in the middle of Death Valley. The sun sizzled overhead, sending out blinding light that reflected off the sands. Rippling mirages rose off the burning hot ground. Dunes surrounded us, looking as dead and lifeless as an alien planet. I looked up at the light blue sky and didn't see a single cloud. It must have been 100 degrees out. Rivulets of sweat trickled down from my hair and forehead, stinging my eyes. I wiped it away, looking back down the hole. I kept expecting this aberration of a pit to evaporate like some sort of bizarre optical illusion, yet there it still stood. A large circle about 30 feet across with ancient granite steps. And, of course, the steps had no railings. They looked fairly narrow, maybe a couple feet across. Well, I considered that narrow, considering the thousands of feet of empty space I would fall through if I slipped. I thought about how the drop would feel, screaming for minutes, and knowing I was about to die, the ground coming up to meet me, the air roaring like a tornado in my ears. I shuddered. The mental image seemed far too vivid. I glanced at my two friends. Bear was casually smoking a cigarette, raising his tattooed hand. I looked at the tattoo, a reptilian, slitted eye surrounded by the golden spiral. He stood much taller than me. Having done physical labor his entire life, he also had a thick covering of muscle. He was a metalhead, an urban explorer, and about 90% of his body was covered in tattoos. Stephanie. And he made an unusual pair, she with her straight edge, valley girl looks, and Bear looking like he just climbed out of a mosh pit at a dayside show. He flicked the half-smoked butt into the pit, smoothing his long black hair with his hands. I watched the red light of the ember streak across the darkness and disappear into the endless shadows waiting below. Do you think anyone else knows about this? I asked. Bear had a sly grin across his scruffy face. His blue eyes flashed with amusement. He put his arm around Stephanie. Well, if no one has, maybe we can make money off of it, he said. Stephanie smiled faintly at that. I've heard of people who discovered caves making money off giving tours. Maybe we can buy this crappy little plot of land out here. This might be state land, I said. Actually, it might even be federal. I'm not sure where the borders of the national park end. Not like anyone would be going around labeling borders out here. I waved my hand lethargically at the dead, sunburnt desert all around us. Absolutely no one lived out here, except maybe the secret mutant descendants of the Manson family. Regardless, we should go explore it, Stephanie said. If we're going to claim we discovered some new wonder of the world, we should be able to tell people what's in it. Yeah, and what if we get lost and starve to death down there? I asked. There's no cell service out here. No one would ever find our bodies. We would just disappear into thin air. We can't even call anyone to let them know where we are. That's part of the adventure, Stephanie said, laughing. You weren't complaining when you dragged us all to that abandoned mental asylum and took us to the underground tunnels. I'm with Stephanie, Bear said, gesticulating crazily with his hands. I want to go explore. I think it would be awesome to have a cave system named after us. We still have flashlights and plenty of food and water in the car. I have lighters and knives, cigarettes, and booze. Hell, even my pistol. Not like I think we'll need it, unless there's rattlesnakes down there that we need to shoot. In hindsight, it was amazing just how wrong he was. We each had a backpack filled with goods. Since we had been traveling across California and camping, seeing every national park possible, we had plenty of extra supplies. In fact, the issue became the amount of weight each of us could carry. I had them fill the backpacks with as much food and water as possible, leaving only room for ammunition, jackets, and some extra clothes. You act like we're going to be down there for the next year, Stephanie complained, rolling her eyes as she hefted the heavy backpack around her shoulder with a soft grunt. Alright, let's do this. I am so excited right now. I feel like Bilbo Baggins must have when he walked out his front door with Gandalf. Bear grinned like a madman, lighting up another cigarette. Without a word or a moment of hesitation, he put his backpack on and jumped down to the first step, a drop of about 5 feet. My stomach did flips just watching him. He apparently had no fear of heights at all. As I looked down on Bear, it struck me how perfect the circular formation of the pit was. It almost looked man-made or somehow unnatural. Nature rarely works in straight lines and perfect circles, after all. Stephanie went next, lowering herself carefully from the edge and hanging down by her arms until her feet were securely on the step. Unlike Bear, who at times I thought might be slightly insane, she did not simply jump onto the stone. I edged closer to the pit, looking down. A sense of vertigo overtook me. The eternal blackness of the void seemed like a dilated pupil, a staring eye. I felt watched from below, but I was not going to look like a chicken shit in front of my friends. They were both clearly excited, especially Bear, who started hopping from one foot to another, anxiously looking up at me and waving me on. He reminded me of a puppy excited about going on a walk. They had already started descending, and stood a few dozen feet below the first step. With a thudding heart, I followed Stephanie's example, slowly lowering myself down from the ledge onto the first step. Once secure, I looked down. The circling stairs almost seemed like a slit-open conch shell, the swirling golden spiral extending into forever. My friends looked so small standing on those unceasing steps, and for a moment, my intuition screamed at me, "Get out, get out." But instead, I took a deep breath and started the descent into the bottomless pit. We traveled for hours. I lost track of time. All of our phones stopped working, and even though I had just charged mine, the screen simply went black. Stephanie's watch stopped ticking after a few minutes descending. I didn't know if there was some kind of magnetism in the pit that disabled electronic devices, but regardless, we no longer had any way to tell time. "God, how long has it been?" Stephanie asked after our 5th break. We sat on the steps, our headlamps sending eerie bouncing shadows all around us. A few of the steps nearby had thin, jagged cracks running through the stone, branching like lightning bolts. I wondered if they would crumble under our feet as we passed. "It feels like at least 6 or 7 hours, Bear said, no longer as excited as he was at the start. Part of it was undoubtedly fatigue, which we all felt. I had a creeping suspicion we had made a colossal mistake by coming down here. Bear still had a sense of determination, however, and he wanted to keep going. "How far down do you think we are?" No one answered. The air felt oppressive and extremely heavy. "What do you want to do if we don't find anything in the next hour or so?" I asked. "I mean, are we just going to keep going down forever? We should make a plan to turn around at a certain point." "Oh man, give me a break," Bear said, rolling his eyes. "What in the hell do you have to do today? You act like this isn't the coolest thing we found on this trip. We should keep going down until we find something, or until we need to turn around because we're running low on water and food. This is probably a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, man." I sighed. My legs ached and my feet screamed at me. I could feel the blisters rising on my toes. We rose and started descending again. It was then that we heard a sound like a lion roaring echoing up from far below. It sounded predatory and animalistic, but magnified to a deafening cacophony like an exploding hydrogen bomb. The stairs began to shake. Falling streams of dust and pebbles streamed down all around us. I tried to scream, but I didn't know if I actually was, because all I could hear was that demonic roar. I clung to the wall of the pit as the sound started to fade, and then rapidly died down to nothing. Within a few seconds, it had passed. I looked at Bear and Stephanie. They looked pale and shaken in the bright LED lights of the headlamp. "Jesus Christ," Bear said, his hands trembling as he reached into his pocket for his pack of cigarettes. I thought I was going to die for a few seconds there. He had succinctly expressed all of our thoughts, I felt. "We can't keep going down," I said. "This is insane. What if that was an earthquake? What if there's more aftershocks coming? We should start heading back up now. I'm not dying here, Stephanie." And Bear nodded, agreeing without any argument. Even Bear, who was normally fearless, seemed to have lost all of his enthusiasm for this adventure. But when we turned and shone our headlamps up, I saw the stairs a few hundred feet above us had collapsed during the bone-rattling explosion of sound. About 30 feet of steps had simply vanished, crumbling into the void. I suddenly felt very much less secure standing there. I wondered how structurally sound the step I stood on really was. My heart felt like it would beat right out of my chest. "Well, I guess the only way out is forwards," Stephanie whispered in a frightened voice. "Maybe this cave or whatever it is has branching tunnels that lead back up. Something this massive has to have more than one way in and out." I didn't really agree with her. However, this pit was not a natural cave system. As far as I could tell, we had no idea if other paths led out. We kept descending. I clung close to the wall in case that ear-splitting cacophony started again. I wondered what had made it. Perhaps the echoes of shifting tectonic plates amplified as they rose up the pit and just sounded like a predator's thundering cry. Far below, my headlamp ran over an aberration in the smooth golden spiral of the endless steps. I saw a massive archway, at least 10 feet tall. Its sides met in a point at the top, forming an upside-down curving V. Bear and Stephanie saw it at the same time as I did. Their eyes widened in surprise and delight, but a sense of fear gripped me when I saw the archway. Its architecture looked alien. As we got closer, I saw it glisten like obsidian. Gleaming black rainbows ran over its length when our lights touched it. "Oh, thank God," Stephanie cried. Bear ran ahead, sprinting down the steps like a man dying of dehydration running towards water. "Hey, wait up," I called, feeling suddenly very vulnerable. I looked down the stairs. Far below me, I saw a thin crack that ran down the wall of the pit for hundreds of feet. I caught a glimpse of a face peeking out of it. The creature had bone-white skin and pure black eyes. Its features seemed a combination of human and demon. Its insane rictus grin showed many sharp, long teeth. Within a fraction of a second, though, it disappeared into the crack, and I wondered whether I had really seen it. Perhaps all the darkness had caused me to start hallucinating. I knew that prolonged sensory deprivation could cause hallucinations and potentially bizarre experiences. Having tried sensory deprivation tanks both sober and after eating magic mushrooms, Stephanie and Bear stood in front of the obsidian arch, peering down a massive stone tunnel. The ceiling towered 30 feet overhead. Sharp stalactites hung over our heads like waiting guillotines. Natural formations of glimmering marble and jewels jutted out of the walls of the light brown rock. Bear ran forwards, laughing. He stopped at the first cluster of gems he saw. They looked like the petals of a multicolored flower, green, white, red, blue, and black. "These are diamonds," Bear said, awed. "This is opal. This looks like jet stone. That's definitely a sapphire. And the one next to it is an emerald." He stood up straight, looking back at me, his mouth hanging open. "Holy hell, Juan, we're rich. None of us will ever have to work again. We still don't even know how to get out of here," I reminded him. I kept checking our backs, and I thought I had glimpsed that white, staring face with the black eyes again, but it moved like a ghost. Every time I tried to shine the light where I thought I glimpsed something, there was nothing there. I felt like I was losing my mind. We kept walking for a few minutes. Smaller tunnels branched off the large ones periodically. We would hear soft moaning sounds and whispers coming from them. I could never pick out any words, as it came across as more of a low susurration, but it had the cadence and rhythm of speech. "That is so creepy," Stephanie whispered after we had passed our fourth branching tunnel. "It sounds just like voices and people whimpering, as if there were some medieval torture chamber over there. It's gotta be some natural echo from the earth," I said. "There are sometimes subterranean rivers and waterfalls. If one was nearby, its babbling could get distorted in the tunnels and come across as whispering." But I didn't really believe the argument myself, even though I badly wanted to. "Oh my God," Bear said. He was out in front, walking ahead of us by at least 10 feet, so he ended up seeing the two bodies first. He started running, kneeling down over the girls, Stephanie, and I followed a few seconds later. They looked like two high school students, still wearing their backpacks covered in pins about love and peace. The nearer of the two girls was clearly dead. Her entire body had swollen up like a tick after feeding, the skin turning green as rancid gases bubbled under the surface. I couldn't even tell if she once had eyes or a mouth because the flesh had expanded so much. Her bloated body pulled against the fabric of her short-sleeved t-shirt, skirt, and straps of her backpack. The other girl was a somewhat different story. At first, I thought she was dead too. I couldn't see any breathing, and she looked extremely pale with a blue tint to her lips. Bear knelt down and tried shaking her. He got no response. Then he licked the back of his hand and held it in front of her mouth and nose. After a few seconds, he looked up excitedly. "She's breathing, though it is very slow and shallow," he said. "I don't know what's wrong with her." Her eyes started to flutter open and she gasped. Her fingers clenched and she licked her dry lips. "Water," she moaned. "Please, water." Bear immediately grabbed a bottle from his pack and held it up to her lips. She took small sips, pulling away and breathing hard after each one, but soon she had finished the entire bottle, then 2 more. The color started to return to her cheeks slightly, though that bluish cast stayed over her fingernails and lips. She motioned for us to get close, then reached into her pocket and pulled out a piece of paper. "I'm not going to make it out of here alive," she said. "This was given to me by someone else. It's the only reason we've made it this far." She coughed, rolling on her side and vomiting some of the water. I saw streaks of blood mixed in, dark red like a garnet. Bear looked at the piece of paper, frowning. He stood back up and turned to face us. Then he started reading out loud. The first rule to survival is this: when you see the angel of death, the woman with the backwards facing head, you must cut your flesh and give an offering of blood immediately. The second rule is that if you hear the first trumpet blow, you must hide. Anyone who does not leave the main tunnel by the time the second trumpet blows will know undying agony. The third rule is that if you see dark silhouettes coming down the corridors, shadows in the shapes of men and beasts, you must close your eyes and count to 30. They are eaters of souls and will suck your soul out of your eyes if you give them the chance, yet they will pass if not fed. The fourth rule is that if you encounter anyone with the mark of Cain, you must kill them immediately. You will know the mark of Cain. When you see it, it is a most hideous thing. The fifth rule is that if you see the ruler of the bottomless pit, whose name is Abaddon, you must not look at his face. They all stood in silence for a long moment. I felt the strong urge to laugh. Then I looked down at the swollen body of the dead girl and immediately changed my mind. The blonde girl yanked her backpack off, gasping and spitting blood constantly. She reached around in the bag, frantically looking for something. With a triumphant smile across her pretty face, she yanked it out and handed it to me. I took the ancient leather-bound Bible. It looked like it had some traces of a white, shining crystal smeared across its cover. I opened the cover and saw someone had written in spiky, copperplate handwriting, "Property of Smiley." A bookmark hung out of the back of the text. I opened it up and gasped. The bookmark was actually a tiny, mummified pinky finger. It looked like someone had cut it off a small child's hand. It smelled woodsy with a hint of pistachio, cinnamon, and sulfur. I have never smelled anything quite like a mummified body part. "Oh my God," Stephanie cried, putting her hands above her mouth. "Is that a child's finger?" The girl didn't answer. She had collapsed on her stomach now, and she looked like she was rapidly worsening. "Who are you? How did you two get here? Why do you have someone's finger?" I asked. The girl shook her head. "No time for all that," she said. "I got a glancing blow of the poison, a very small dose, but it's doing its work nonetheless. I can feel it writhing like snakes through my blood." She closed her eyes for a long moment, breathing slow. Then she fixed her unsteady, watery eyes on us again. "My name is Bella, though. I'll tell you that we came here by accident, exploring underground tunnels with my rainbow family. We got lost, and the tunnel started changing." A shriek echoed from further down the main tunnel, cutting her off. Bella's eyes flew wide open, bright spots of red showing on her pale face. She began hyperventilating. They're coming back," she cried. "Oh God, help me." I saw a shape far away, like a galloping horse. My mind couldn't comprehend what I was seeing for a moment. It looked totally alien, something not from this world. There was a sound like helicopter blades slicing through the air, jarring and rhythmic. As it got closer, I saw a bizarre and monstrous creature. It looked almost like a giant flying scorpion. It was about the size of a Great Dane. Its legs writhed and skittered like massive alien eyelashes. I saw its stinger dripping clear, lethal venom, as if it were salivating through its tail. Its spiky wings looked like those of a dragonfly's, blurring in a sea of motion as they propelled it forward. It was, in reality, the face that affected me most. However, it had a human face, complete with changing expressions. It had no hair on its body, but even without eyebrows, I could see the scowl of bloodlust and fury. The eyes had a filmy look, as if covered in cataracts. The pupils looked faded behind the veil, the irises a muddy gray. Bristling spikes stood out the top of its head, black, pushed-back quills with barbs on the end. Overall, the creature was one of the most instinctually repugnant and frightening creatures I had ever seen. Bear and Stephanie stood there, their mouths opened, just staring. Bella tried to crawl away. She had thrown her backpack to the side. "No," she moaned. "No, Bear." I cried. "Shoot it. Shoot the goddamn thing. What are you waiting for?" He looked like a man waking up from a nightmare. For a moment, his eyes moving quickly around before focusing on me. Then a smile broke out on his face. With the creature only a few steps away, I thought we were all dead. But in a blur, Bear yanked the giant black pistol from its holster. With a booming echo like a shout from God, he fired at the abomination's eerily human face. The head exploded in a fountain of bone splinters and bright blue blood. Its wings continued to pound the air crazily, and the body continued coming at us for a few more feet. Then it crashed to the ground, sliding, its stinger and tail still striking out at the air. I jumped back and saw Bear and Stephanie do the same. It landed on top of Bella, soaking her in its blood. She screamed. The stinger continued to drip clear poison from its wicked-looking barb. I saw drops of it sliding off the creature's body and onto Bella's skin. It burns, she cried, trying to wipe away the poison. But she was on her stomach, and with the creature pinning her down, she couldn't reach. Like some ancient Chinese water torture, the drops continued to fall, searing and lethal. I need help, guys, Bear said, as he tried to lift the heavy creature off Bella, Stephanie, and I went around, giving the stinger and poison a wide berth. I reached under its body. It felt slimy, cold, and just revolting. It was like the texture of drowned earthworms after a summer rain. As I pushed, I felt a sogginess in its skin, and blue blood the color of antifreeze soaked my hands. I wanted to pull away. I felt soiled. I wanted to take a long shower and wipe the filth of this creature off me. The body started to lift. With a grunt, the three of us pushed it off Bella. I looked down at her and realized it was too late. Her eyes rolled back in her head, showing only the whites. Her legs began to kick violently, her fingers spasming. As her arms jumped and danced, she began to make a choked, gasping sound. Then her skin started to turn a sickly, cancerous green. Her whole body began to swell. Before our eyes, she gave a death gasp and stopped kicking, finally falling limp. As we left the corpses behind, still shaken, Bear looked at the Bible Bella had given us. Juan, why do you think there's a human finger in here? Stephanie asked, still repulsed by it. Is that some sort of occult thing? Maybe witchcraft? I shrugged. I knew a lot more about history and books than either Bear or Stephanie. They almost never read, while I read constantly. Fingers have been used in occult rituals for thousands of years. In the ancient Buddhist scriptures, a madman, an extremely talented warrior, used to go around killing random people and taking their fingers for a necklace. They called him Angulimala, or finger necklace. There may be some relation to worship of Kali, the goddess of destruction. He ended up converting to Buddhism, renouncing violence, and becoming enlightened. Though, in modern rituals, witchcraft still uses severed fingers. Fingers represent dexterity, touch, and manipulation of faraway objects. Cutting off a finger also symbolically represents a cutting of ties in an occult ritual. I shrugged. Well, thank you for that enlightening information, chatbot, Stephanie said jokingly. You remind me of those AI robots, where you can ask them any random question, and they come up with an answer. Hey, don't trash about me just because I actually do research, I said, smiling. Speaking of research, what page of the Bible is the finger marking? It may be important. Those girls had two things, after all, the list of rules and the Bible. Bella obviously considered them important, because those were the only two things she singled out to give to us while she was dying. Bear opened the Bible to the page with the finger. He looked down, frowning. It's Revelation 9, he said. Then he began reading aloud as we all took a break, passing around water and peanut butter crackers. And the fifth angel sounded, and I saw a star fall from heaven unto the earth, and to him was given the key of the bottomless pit. And he opened the bottomless pit, and there rose a smoke out of the pit, as the smoke of a great furnace, and the sun and the air were darkened by reason of the smoke of the pit. And there came out of the smoke locusts upon the earth, and unto them was given power, as the scorpions of the earth have power. And it was commanded them that they should not hurt the grass of the earth, neither any green thing, neither any tree, but only those men which have not the seal of God in their foreheads. And to them it was given that they should not kill them, but that they should be tormented 5 months. And their torment was as the torment of a scorpion when he striketh a man. And in those days shall men seek death, and shall not find it, and shall desire to die, and death shall flee from them. He stopped reading, his voice reverberating eerily down the stone corridor, bouncing off of priceless gems and hard sandstone. So that thing we killed was a locust? Stephanie asked. It looked a lot more like a scorpion to me. It doesn't really matter, it's neither a scorpion nor a locust, I said. It's clearly a different species from either. Perhaps it's lived down here for millions of years, hunting in the dark. But it just makes it all the more important to find a way out of here as soon as possible. There could be thousands of those things down here. Millions, maybe. I mean, really. Who knows how big this place is? Sighing, we got up and continued looking for a way out. Ahead, I saw a faded sign. It looked made out of pure silver, without a sign of rust anywhere. But the letters had nearly disappeared over the many years it had clearly stood here. When we got close, I brought my light right up to it and tried to make it out. After a few seconds, I realized it was a sign for a town. Bloodstone, population 144,000, it read. The faded, ancient sign for the town seemed to point down a smaller branching corridor to our left. There were no gyms or high caverns on this path. It seemed like some ancient civilization had carved the narrow corridor out of the stone itself. A path a few feet wide stretched out in front of us, going totally straight, as far as the eye could see. Which way? There asked. Stephanie looked excitedly down the path to Bloodstone. Population 144,000, at least if I believe the sign. Obviously towards the town. We don't know where this main tunnel leads. It could just go on forever. If there's a town, there's people, she said. There's no goddamn town down here, I said. Are you nuts? Who would live down here in the darkness? She shrugged. We walked for hours down the carved stone trail to Bloodstone. It went straight the entire way until it started to open up. The ceiling and walls expanded until, within a few minutes, we found ourselves in an enormous cavern. There were doors and empty windows carved into the rock. Even the ladders were made from stone. I saw hundreds of these ancient homes, stacked one on top of another. A pale face peeked around the corner, its massive black eyes practically bulging out of its head. Hey, wait, I said as the creature turned and ran away. It looked vaguely human in its general body shape, but extremely pale, hairless, and with much larger eyes. I wondered if these were some strange offshoot of the human species, lost souls who had gotten caught down here thousands of years ago and had evolved to survive in these harsh conditions. It sprinted away, webbed feet slapping hard against the slippery rock trail sloping upwards through the center of these endless carved-out empty houses. Within seconds, I had lost it. It sprinted forwards like a greyhound, far faster than any two-legged creature should be able to run. I heard the wet smacking of its giant webbed feet receding into the distance, saw its long, mutant hands flying back and forth in time with its stride. A gunshot rang out. I kept running towards where I had seen the creature last. I saw a man in a black Kevlar vest and camouflage pants pointing a smoking R-15 down at the writhing humanoid's head. An exit wound the size of a grapefruit emerged from the back of its chest. It began to spit bright red blood onto its pale skin, its large, black eyes rolling in pain and terror. A man pulled the trigger again, and the back of the humanoid's skull disintegrated, a waterfall of brain matter and dark blood streaming out beneath it. It started to form a spreading puddle on the cold stone. Hey, I cried out, shocked. It's a person. He looked up suddenly. I saw he had tanned, almost golden skin and very dark eyes. His face and head looked freshly shaved. His entire demeanor screamed military, or perhaps a hired gun. He pointed the rifle at us. Put your hands up, he said slowly. He had a strange accent that sounded vaguely Caribbean, but I couldn't place it. We all put our hands up slowly, though I saw Bear's fingers twitch as if he wanted to go for his pistol. Where did you come from? Death Valley, I said. Of course. Where did you enter? He paused, looking at us for a long moment. Don't worry about me, he said. What's your name? We introduced ourselves. He grunted. You all need to turn around. My agency is currently doing excavations in this area, and we don't need civilians running around. It's bad enough we have these things crawling everywhere. He pointed to the white, mutated corpse bleeding at his feet, emitting a rank smell of shellfish and coppery blood. Is that the mark of Cain? Blair asked. We were told to watch out for something called the mark of Cain. The man laughed. The mark of Cain looks nothing like this. Those with the mark lose all their skin. It just peels away. Hard bones start to grow over their bodies. They grow black veins throbbing with poison all over the outside of their faces, arms, and chests, and their eyes and mouths turn a rotten, sickly shade of green. You will know the mark of Cain instantly. Their blood is poison, and they are almost impossible to kill. They have regenerative properties from whatever strange chemicals flow through their black blood. No, the mark of Cain is much uglier than these poor idiots. These creatures are just inbred descendants of some long-lost race. We call them the fishmen, for obvious reasons. Looking at the webbed feet and hands and the slimy, bone-white skin, I could see why they would name them that. They even gave off a fishy, salty odor as if the smell of a faint ocean breeze blew through the passageway. What agency do you represent? I asked. The man paused for a long moment, looking like he was thinking hard about the answer. He opened his mouth. Well, it depends who, he started to say. A resonation began to sound, cutting him off. At first I thought it was an earthquake sending off echoing cacophonous vibrations through the cavern, but as it grew louder I could hear the shrieking, harmonizing notes of some massive trumpet. Rocks started to fall all around us, first just small pebbles from cracks in the ceiling and walls, and then larger and larger stones. I saw the soldier spin away from us and begin running towards one of the houses carved into the stone. I tried calling him, but I couldn't even hear myself scream in the din of the deafening trumpets. With my adrenaline spiking, I motioned for Bear and Stephanie to follow. Without looking back to see if they would, I started sprinting towards the same house the soldier had entered. I did not want to lose the one person who might know what's going on. The trumpet cut out as suddenly as it had begun. I heard the heavy thudding of many booted feet behind us. I glanced back quickly and saw dozens more soldiers, all armed with AR-15s and bulletproof vests. They screamed something at the soldier I followed, but my ears rang so loud I could only see their mouths moving as if from a silent movie. I figured it was something along the lines of, "What do we do?" But by then the second trumpet blast had sounded. My ears rang as the soldiers' mouths moved, yet it was as if no sound came out. Bear, Stephanie, and I got inside the carved chamber as the second and much shorter trumpet blast cut off. The last ringing vibrations disappeared down the endless tunnels. For a long moment, nothing happened. The soldiers continued to run towards us, screaming and asking for orders. I heard a hissing sound, as if a gas main had been cut. A suffocating, chemical smell began to fill the cavern. I took a deep breath and held it. A sense of rising pressure seemed to fill the air. Then the ground outside the house erupted with fire, like a hydrogen bomb going off. Clear blue flames shot up in the center of the tunnel floor. I heard a whooshing sound. As the inferno spread, long tongues of flame rose, licking the stone walls. The men stopped in their tracks, their uniforms immediately starting to catch fire, their skin liquefying and falling off in molten drops. Their mouths opened in a silent scream. I could hear the sizzling of their bodies, like bacon grease spitting out of a hot pan. They danced, jumping from foot to foot, their arms punching at the air. In a matter of seconds, I saw all their clothes disappear into smoking ashes, blowing away from their bodies in the slight wind that blew through the cave. I felt no heat at all standing on the stone floor of the ancient house, but I smelled the burning hair and searing meat of their melting bodies. Within a few more seconds, only blackened skeletons stood there, the grinning skulls still looking in our direction, before they collapsed to the smoking stone floor. The fire disappeared as quickly as it had started. The boiling blue flames seemed to suck back into the earth itself. Bear and Stephanie looked at our new companion with horror-struck faces. He did not look nearly as perturbed as I would have thought, seeing his entire company wiped out. He simply shook his head. "Blackwater keeps sending us rookies," he said, giving us a half smile. "They gotta learn somehow, right?" We learned that the man's name was Agent Garland. He was vague on why he was down there with hired goons. We hadn't talked for more than a minute when we heard a strange wailing coming through the town. Everyone went deathly quiet. Immediately, Agent Garland's eyes went wide, and he started breathing fast. I looked out the threshold, peering to the right, the direction we had come, and seeing nothing but a smooth stone passageway. Stephanie stood on my other side. I heard her gasp. I turned my head to the left, and immediately knew what had scared her. It looked like thousands of black silhouettes slithering and limping and twisting down the road, coming closer and closer to us. I saw pure ebony shadows in the shape of venomous snakes dozens of feet long. Others had 2 legs and 2 arms like a man, but their limbs looked as thin as sticks, and their bodies stood 20 feet high. Their faces were expressionless, like a black ski mask with no holes for the eyes or mouth. The wailing grew closer, more insistent. It sounded like a mother broken with grief over the death of her children, a kind of hysterical shrieking that only amplified in the massive cavern. It bounced off the ceiling a dozen stories above our heads, echoing and distorting. Stephanie and Bear screamed behind me. Rivers of sweat ran down my face. "There was a rule about this," I yelled, barely hearing myself over the wailing. Stephanie and Bear continued to look at me with wide, staring eyes. Agent Garland simply smiled, waiting. I tried to remember the list of rules. Though this happened years ago, I remember the panic that set in as my mind drew a blank. There was too much stress, too much going on around me. I couldn't focus or think clearly. I took a deep breath and cleared my mind. In an instant, my subconscious started spitting up pieces of the rules. I remembered slowly. The rules discussed not looking at the face of Abaddon, getting off the main path if the trumpet sounded, something about the angel of death, killing people with the mark of Cain. It came to me in a flash. The rules had said something about shadows attacking us through our eyes. Close your eyes, I screamed as loudly as I could. The wailing was right outside the empty stone threshold now. Without looking to see if my friends had heard, I slammed my eyes shut and waited, counting the beats of my thudding heart. The wailing cut off suddenly. I felt a presence standing directly next to me and heard a low, guttural moaning. Something cold gently caressed my back and arms before rising to my cheek. Soft footsteps fell all around us, a sound as light as tall grass blowing in a breeze, hissing, and a deep, choked gurgling erupted from something behind me. I felt more and more cold tendrils and hands pressing against my skin. A sense of rising pressure surrounded my body. I felt like screaming, my skin crawling. I tried to pull away, but I was surrounded on all sides by the grasping alien hands. They disappeared all at once with the sound of a massive balloon popping. I heard Bear slowly exhaling behind me. Agent Garland laughed. My heart beat a frenzied, runaway rhythm that pounded in my ears. Okay, it's been 30 seconds, Bear said, sounding out of breath. You can open your eyes. We decided to rest and have a meal in the house. The stress of nearly dying twice had done a number on us psychologically. I felt totally drained. I would have liked to lay down and rest. We had traveled for many hours. My feet screamed at me with throbbing blisters and waves of sharp pain. So what are you going to do now? I asked Agent Garland as I pulled out sardines and crackers. I tore into them ravenously, chugging a couple of bottles of Gatorade as I ate. Can you get us out of here? I'm not really in charge of this mission, he said without meeting my gaze. He shifted uncomfortably from foot to foot. The main group is down far below us. You would have to ask the commander. What are they doing down there? Stephanie asked, her curiosity piqued. Is there something important for national defense? Agent Garland smiled. There's something important for everything, he said, a cynical gleam reflecting off his face. God lives down there. He's kept locked up by the angels because, well, I shouldn't be the one who has to tell you this, but God has gone totally insane. He gave a large part of his mind to create the universe, and now he's slowly dying down there, like the serpent eating its own tail. We're actually in his body right now, walking through these tunnels of the bottomless pit. Those fires and shadow creatures are like immune cells, trying to kill all trespassers. Only those with the sign of heaven on their foreheads don't get targeted. What's the sign of heaven? I asked. He waved his hand at that. Nothing you need to worry about, because you won't be getting it. Only the angels have the sign, he said. It's like a white, pulsing symbol on their foreheads. It kind of looks like a backwards 7 with a slashing diagonal line through it. I don't know what language it is or what it means. The angels are not exactly conducive to talking. They're more likely to kill you on sight. Agent Garland got up, stretching and sighing. Well, this has been fun, but I have to meet up with the main group and report the casualties. It's not the first time, and it won't be the last, but there's always so much goddamned paperwork. He pointed his index finger at the still smoldering bones accusingly. I saw only tiny fragments remaining now. The fine gray ashes blew in the light breeze down the tunnel. The cave not only cremates people, I thought with a hint of hysteria, it even spreads their ashes for them, almost like a loving family member. I shuddered. Agent Garland started walking out without a backwards glance. I jumped up. Wait, I said, Bear. And Stephanie joined in my chorus of yelling, their hysterical voices rising in a frenzy. You can't just leave us here. Do you at least know the way out? The way out, he responded, still walking away, is further in. If you find the center, you'll find the exit. There are many paths in, but only one out. So it is, and so it has always been. And with that cryptic message, Agent Garland disappeared around the corner. I wondered if I would ever see him again. After a minute of discussion, we decided to follow in Agent Garland's tracks. We hoped that if he was heading down into the deeper levels, the center where he claimed God lived, that we could simply tag along and get the hell out of this madhouse. And yet, no matter how fast we walked, we couldn't catch a glimpse of him. I didn't know if there were secret tunnels somewhere in the thousands of stacked stone houses of Bloodstone. But if there were, we had a snowball's chance in hell of just finding one of them randomly. This is BS, Bear said gruffly, sweating heavily again. He sulked like an angry child, fingering his holstered gun. We headed deeper into Bloodstone. It looked like it had once been a marvelous city. It had ancient stone posts where lamps used to burn. In the center of street intersections, beautiful statues of angels loomed over the dead land. The caverns opened up above us more and more. After it had risen hundreds of feet, our flashlights lost sight of it. The headlamps simply would not pierce into the darkness that deeply. These look like the statues Michelangelo did, Stephanie observed, looking at a heavily muscled angel in a robe ripping open the jaws of a massive serpent. The angel's stone wings hung out behind it, long projections that dwarfed its body, but it looked different from the statues of angels I had seen. Its wings looked much more reptilian, like the wings a dragon might have. They had bat-like webbing between the pointed bones that ran out in a graceful curve to spikes, and its eyes had a sheen of cruelty and arrogance that came through even in the carving. I pointed this out to Bear and Stephanie. They looked slightly unnerved by the observation. Well, who's to say that the descriptions of angels done by ancient artists have any relevance to reality? Stephanie said. They could look reptilian, or could be made of light, or they could be totally extraterrestrial and incomprehensible. Humans only base observations of life on what they see on Earth, but they can't comprehend what other forms life could take. Maybe these angels aren't even from our planet. I thought about it. What she said made a lot of sense. Now, there's no way evolution would make such a similar creature to a human being, Bear said, speaking for the first time. I jumped slightly. These angels look like people with wings to a large extent. So either people and angels evolved from a common ancestor, or people were made in the image of angels, or I'm saying that these statues might not be what the angels actually look like, Stephanie said. Oh, yeah, okay, Bear said, returning to his sullen state. He continued to keep his hand on the holstered pistol, nervously looking left and right. I felt it too. There was a feeling of being watched. We continued to walk through the streets of Bloodstone. I caught glimpses of what I assumed were what Agent Garland called the fishmen, white, pale faces with large, black eyes. They were extremely fast, and by the time I even glimpsed one out of the corner of my eye, it had gone. But they didn't bother us. They seemed content with just watching us pass. Maybe they were more afraid of us than we were of them. We had entered a different part of the city with graceful towers that extended far up into the darkness when we encountered the first creature with the evil deformity called the Mark of Cain. These remind of the Leaning Tower of Pisa, Stephanie observed as Bear smoked a cigarette, trailing behind us. I looked up the architecture with admiration. The ground floor of the massive stone tower had dozens of archways leading in, almost like a spider's compound eyes looking out on the abandoned city. These ancient people must have been powerful to build all this, I said. Do you think they tunneled it out of? A soft sound interrupted me, but in the silence, it came out jarring. I heard a choked, gurgling laughter. It was a soft sound that quickly faded to nothing, like a man with a slit throat trying to laugh in his final moments. But I could tell from the way Stephanie and Bear froze that we had all heard it. Bear took out his gun and spun to face the threat. A tall, twisted figure slid silently out of one of the shadowy archways of a nearby tower. Its head nearly scraped the top of the threshold, a height of nearly 10 feet. As our headlamps illuminated the newcomer, I saw a face straight from the wildest nightmares of a delirium tremens patient. The description Agent Garland had given us of the Mark of Cain paled in comparison to its true horror. It looked like its face had somehow flipped inside out. It had no skin or eyelids or hair anywhere. The bony, off-white skeletal plates on its forehead joined with raised cracks running across its scalp like ugly scars. Two eyes shone out with a shade of green that reminded me of putrefying infection and fetid swamps. They glowed with their own inner light. Dark, twisting veins ran like the slash marks across its entire body, robbing with each beat of its alien heart. They writhed like fat worms, a rapid, quivering pulse passing through them every few moments. The creature's strange, green eyes glowed brighter with excitement and bloodlust. It had no lips, just sharp bones that met in a line. When its mouth was closed, I couldn't see any sign of it, but as its plated legs sprinted with powerful strides towards us, it opened its mouth in a silent scream. I saw its jaw unhinge like a snake's, falling down to its chest. More sickly green light flooded out, illuminating the entire street with its fetid illumination. As it got to within 20 feet of us, I saw that deep cracks ran through the rest of its body, zigzagging in small, tight lines like black stitches. There fired. It rang through the rocky cavern with a blast like a cannon firing. I saw the first bullet smash into the creature's face. Part of its skeletal face blew apart, the cheek shattering like ceramic. In a frenzy of bullets, Bear pulled the trigger again, and again in the space of a second. The abomination's kneecaps and shin bones were covered in white, bony plates, almost reminding me of some ancient gladiator's protective uniform. But the large caliber bullets of the pistol blew the legs of the creature apart in a flash of bone splinters and black blood. The smell of gunsmoke filled the air. I also noticed a subtler, but still somewhat foul stench that reminded me of sulfur and campfire smoke that emanated from the creature's body. With an ear-splitting shriek like a steam whistle exploding, its open green mouth erupted with cyclonic whirls of green light. A piece of the light spun off from the bubbling, frothing mass streaming from its mouth. The piece looked like some sort of floating cloud of ball lightning about the size of a basketball. It came at us like a cannonball from hell, blurring through the air. Rippling currents of electricity sizzled and popped as it spun, flying straight at Stephanie's head. An overwhelming odor of ozone followed it. Bear sprinted towards Stephanie. I saw it happen as if in slow motion. He tackled Stephanie to the cold stone ground. The ball lightning flew over her head and missed her by mere inches. As she fell, her hair flew up. A flash erupted as the ball lightning touched a lock of it. That part of her hair erupted into blue flames and disappeared without leaving ashes or smoke. The abomination dragged itself across the ground like a possum with a snapped spine, still emanating its steam whistle shriek. Its eyes and mouth flashed brighter, and the black veins pulsed faster. A moment later, another ball of green lightning shot out. The way it rolled off the larger mass of light reminded me of how vendors at the carnival swirled cotton candy around a paper cone. It bristled, shivering with its own trembling energy. Then it flew at me. I stood amazed as it curved through the air, this new death sensation that shone with a cancerous green light. So you want to hear my story, huh? Straight from the horse's mouth, as they say. Why not? Maybe you'll actually listen to me. That'd be a nice change of pace. I'm sure you've already read the version in the papers, the account my erstwhile coworkers gave about my breakdown. I'm certain the morons went on and on about how normal I seemed, how they couldn't possibly have imagined what was secretly going on in my head. Oh, that Madeline, I never would have guessed. Pricks, it's probably because there isn't anything wrong with me. I'm perfectly sane, which is quite a remarkable feat, I'd say, given my circumstances. They've pumped me so full of drugs I feel higher than a goddamn hot air balloon. But I'm trying my best to stay lucid, trying my best to remember the truth. Well, I say perfectly sane, but that's not entirely true. I've got to stay honest. I have to be consistent. If I start telling lies, even little ones like that, I'm no better than the gaslighting quacks insisting that I'm a danger to society. Prior to my imprisonment, my institutionalization, I was diagnosed with a mild form of obsessive-compulsive disorder. Nothing too severe, you understand. No intrusive thoughts telling me to kill the president, or to peel off my own skin, or anything like that. I just have a tendency to be a little fussy about people touching my things, and have chronically scaly-looking skin from the frequency with which I wash my hands. I was on medication. I was dealing with it. I doubt anybody even noticed. Now, of course, they've been giving me all sorts of wonderful diagnoses, a veritable smorgasbord of neuroses and complexes. All the usual suspects are there. Paranoid schizophrenia, antisocial personality disorder. I believe one doctor even suggested dissociative identity disorder, though I've never shown even the slightest sign of having some sort of separate personality. But it makes them feel better to give me labels, to categorize me as something that they can understand. The language changes, of course. One must accede to the endless demands of the euphemism treadmill, but we all know what they think I am, a madwoman. To them, I'm just a frightful maniac, a slasher out of a bad horror film who tried to cut up some innocent, normal person because the voices in my head told me to. They're too blinded by their own idiotic dogma to accept the truth, that the world is not as they think it is, and we are not alone. I'd better start at the beginning, shouldn't I? As you almost certainly already know, I used to work as a bookkeeper for my local grocery store. I basically was in charge of counting the money from the tills to ensure that there weren't any discrepancies, and consequently spent a lot of time alone in a nice, soundproof little booth, away from the hustle and bustle of the endless parade of idiot customers. Of course, I had to wear gloves. I can't stand handling money without them, but ever since the pandemic, nobody really bothered me about it like they used to when I was younger. It wasn't all sunshine and roses though. There were downsides to my job. In addition to being bookkeeper, I was also a customer service representative, which meant that whenever some moron called the store asking if we carried such and such brand of cereal or the like, I was the one who had to answer the phone. Besides this, I also had to answer any inquiries at the service desk and deal with the horde of senile, geriatrics, for whom the phrase rewards app may as well have spoken in ancient Greek for all the understanding it elicited. I'd also have to deal with the occasional geezer telling me to take off my face mask, insisting that the pandemic was over. In truth, while I did wear it partially out of a desire to keep myself safe from germs, the real reason was that I simply hated having to fake a smile. I've been told I have something of a resting bitch face. Nevertheless, as far as jobs go, bookkeeping wasn't too bad. I managed to tolerate it to the best of my ability, and while I never made any real friendships with my coworkers, we all got along just fine, more or less. That is, until she arrived. The elderly store manager, one errand raid, gathered us all up one afternoon for an impromptu store meeting, where he cheerfully announced that he would be retiring in a few weeks, and that we would be welcoming a new manager to our humble little store. Aaron was always one for dramatics, and with a flourish of his hand, out from behind the door to the manager's office stepped Marie Vasilka. From the instant I saw her, I hated her. Now, I must make it entirely clear, I'm not prejudiced. The hatred wasn't born of some irrational bigotry. It wasn't as though she were ugly in some way either. She had a bland sort of beauty to her, the sort of prettiness that appeals to the widest possible audience, the lowest common denominator of aesthetic preference. She wore a full face of makeup. Her light brown hair was set up perfectly in some trendy but modest style, and she wore well-tailored slacks and a perfectly fit black turtleneck. Everything about her was almost unnaturally perfect, like a digital camera filter was permanently applied to her, so she always appeared in just the right light. I'll admit that all these details didn't jump out at first. Instead, what affected me the most, ensuring immediately that I would not get along with her, was her smile. There is a certain expression, unique to the field of customer service, that denotes someone who feels perfectly fulfilled in that most degrading line of work, a grin representing such infinite shallowness that the mind boggles trying to conceptualize it. Marie Vasilka had the unmistakable, hollow smirk of someone who genuinely tried their absolute best to live her company's values, who really did believe in the timeless maxim, the customer is always right. When she introduced herself to us, my suspicions of her soulless devotion to her career were instantly confirmed. She had a perfect customer service voice, that slightly too high-pitched tone of polite concern that could immediately soothe even the most cantankerous of coupon-clipping grandmothers. Her every motion was like that of an actress playing a role in a cruddy B movie, stiff and wooden. She represented everything I hated about this job, all the worst aspects of the service industry rolled into one smiling, polite package. Still, in spite of my immediate revulsion upon interacting with her, I tried my best to be as cordial as I could stomach, and made an effort not to roll my eyes when she remarked upon how I had such a lovely name. I'm not an asshole. After all, I understand that the universe doesn't revolve around me, and that it takes all sorts to make up this world we live in, regardless of whether or not I like them. As it turned out, my first impression of Ms. Vasilka being a chronically happy workaholic proved to be entirely correct. As Aaron went about training her, she always had that same blandly polite smile upon her face. The worst part of it all, though, was her insistence that every single one of the other employees should share in her peppy, optimistic view of life. Even while Aaron was still guiding her around the store, getting her acquainted with the various departments and the like, she couldn't help but comment on things that might be improved. She'd point out when cashiers were standing about with nothing to do, waiting for customers, and tell them to work on cleaning up the check stands. She would always notice when a shelf could use a bit of tidying up or some item needed restocking. She seemed to get some sort of perverse joy from efficiency, as though she had no higher aspiration in life than to be a beautifully gleaming cog in some vast, perfectly calibrated machine. Eventually, Aaron did good on his word with regards to his retirement, and we had a little going away party for him, complete with cake, balloons, and the like. Marie was there, of course, and I took note of the fact that she didn't partake in any of the refreshments, instead just making sure to engage everyone she could in some bland small talk, the exact sort of conversation I always despised. I tried to quietly excuse myself a bit early, insisting that I had some work to do in the booth. On my way out, however, Marie stopped me, tapping a hand on my shoulder to grab my attention. Her hand felt stiffer than it should have been, as though I were being prodded with a stick rather than human flesh. I turned to see her smiling face, eyes staring straight at me with uncomfortably direct eye contact. Do you want to know what she said? Do remember to smile, Maddie. It's an important part of serving our customers. As I believe I mentioned, I wore a face mask to work, for the express purpose of not needing to deal with any of this nonsense. Point blank, I asked how she knew if I was smiling or not, given that my mouth was covered. She replied that you can always tell if someone is smiling, Maddie, even if you can't see their mouth. Why heck, sometimes people smile with their mouth, but not with their eyes. I think it's really important for our customers that we smile with our whole face, don't you? The whole time she spoke, her face was locked into that perfect, happy grin. She was, as she put it, smiling with her whole face. It made me quite uncomfortable. I mumbled some sort of generic grunt of agreement and turned to leave, but she grabbed me by the shoulder and quite forcibly turned me back around to face her. Marie's hand was hard upon my shoulder, a vice grip in fact. I was baffled, not to mention frightened, but all Marie had to say was, "I'm sorry, I don't quite think I heard what you said. Do make sure to enunciate properly, Maddie, it's only polite." I forced a smile and carefully spoke the words, "I understand. Thank you, Marie. May I go to the booth now?" Marie nodded, replied that I may, and then went back to join the party. The whole affair scared me, more than I at the time thought it should have. By the time I got back to my booth, I had myself a short cry because there was something so utterly terrifying about Marie. I described her earlier as moving like an actress in a bad film, but you must understand, I don't mean that as if to say she was faking her persona. It's just that she genuinely happened to behave in that way. All the shoddiness of bad acting with all the sincerity of real life, a person who was fundamentally wrong on some level. It was that night after her bizarre order for me to smile that I had the first of the nightmares. I've never been much of a dreamer, you understand, so when I do have one I'm inclined to remember it. This particular dream was among the most vivid I've ever experienced. I was all alone in the grocery store. There were no other coworkers or customers about. I was simply walking through the aisles, completely solitary, yet with an intense feeling of being watched. Every security camera seemed to be pointed directly at me, a beady mechanical eye judging my very soul. After a few minutes of aimless wandering about the store, growing increasingly tense and paranoid, my dream self was startled by an announcement on the intercom. "Maddie, could you please come to the office? Maddie, to the office please." It goes without saying whose voice it was. Nobody else ever calls me Maddie. I didn't want to go to the office. The whole idea sent a shiver down my spine, as though someone had poured ice water down the collar of my shirt. But I didn't have a voice. In that manner unique to dreams, I unwillingly felt myself begin to walk steadily towards Marie's office, one agonizing step at a time. All the while I could feel her smiling eyes watch my every movement through the myriad cameras. I finally reached the door to the office, closed, but with a sign attached to it saying "Come right in," in bold Comic Sans. Below the tacky letters was a picture of a yellow smiley face. I felt myself push open the door, revealing the office. It was sparsely decorated, with not so much as a picture of Marie's family on the desk, though in retrospect I doubt that she has anything we'd be likely to call a family in the normal sense of the word. She simply sat there, smiling, unmoving, like a wax statue. I sat down in the chair opposite her, and we began to stare at one another. The staring, oh dear God, the staring. It went on for what felt like hours, nightmare logic permitting my eyes to remain open despite the impossibly long stretch of time. It didn't stop them from hurting, though. The whole time I could feel my eyes itching, begging me to let them close, but I couldn't. All the while, Marie continued to look at me, eyes effortlessly remaining open, the smile fixed upon her face. She didn't say anything. No words were spoken between us. She didn't even seem to breathe. As far as I could tell, we just sat, each of us the other's mirror, locked in some sort of hellish staring contest that I knew I could never win, even though the nightmare permitted me the strength to avoid blinking for lengths of time. That would be unimaginable in the real world. I still knew that I would have to eventually. Finally, after perhaps 2 or 3 hours, I could feel that I was going to give in, that my eyes would blink. I was terrified, sweating with the fear of what would happen, wanting to shriek from the painful effort it took to try and keep my eyelids open, but unable to muster even a whimper. I felt my strained, bloodshot eyes begin to close against my will. I woke up in bed bolt upright, screaming at the top of my lungs. As I said, that was the first of the nightmares. They began to recur every single night, always the exact same way, never deviating in the slightest of minutiae, save that the demoniac staring contest lasted longer each time. Fairly soon it began to feel as though I was spending more time in those dreams than in the waking world. The lack of rest began to affect me after only a few days of these terrible dreams. I felt listless, paranoid, and stressed all the time. I was scarcely able to tolerate the customer service portion of my job, having little patience for those idiots with their completely banal problems, and I found myself making frequent errors in my bookkeeping work as well. However, I did my best to perform my duties to a satisfactory extent, as I couldn't bear the thought of being called up to Marie's office to be forced to turn my nocturnal terrors into a waking reality as the days turned to weeks, and the dreams showed no signs of fading. I'll admit I found myself acquiring a certain fixation on Marie Vasilka. I suppose it is rather difficult not to focus on someone who makes nightly appearances in your dreams. I took to observing her covertly, peeking glances at her whenever I could, though I never dared to go up to her office if I could help it, at least when I knew she was there. I began to notice things that I never would have realized unless I was paying such close attention. For one thing, I never once observed Marie eat or drink while on the clock. At first I assumed that she merely took her lunch breaks in her office, or perhaps in her car, but it became increasingly obvious that Ms. Vasilka didn't even take any breaks. She would clock in, work continuously without pause for what seemed to be 9 or 10-hour shifts, and then clock out. She never even took so much as a bathroom break. Then there were the physical details, things that I hadn't noticed at first but stuck out plain as day now that I was obsessively observing her. I realized with some confusion one day that despite how much time I'd spent looking at Marie, both in my nightmares and the waking world, I hadn't the foggiest idea how old she was. Something about her face seemed timeless. I found that I must have drastically underestimated the amount of makeup she wore when I first met her, because increasingly it seemed to me that her face had a frankly unnatural shininess to it. There was something odd about her skin too, an abnormality of texture that more closely reminded me of some sort of rubber than living tissue. The final revelation, the thing that thoroughly convinced me of the fact that there's something supernatural about Marie Vasilka, was her eyes. I was observing Marie assisting a customer from the comfort of my booth, as it was fortunately equipped with a one-way mirror through which I could keep an eye out to see if anyone approached the service desk. I watched her listlessly as she patiently conversed with the middle-aged gentleman who had interrupted her walk of the store, as she calmly and politely answered his questions, nodding at the appropriate times. I began to be overcome with a dawning sense of dread. This interaction went on for nearly 10 minutes, and yet, in all that time, not once did I see Marie blink. Throughout the rest of that shift, I kept my eye out for Marie, always trying to see if I could catch her blinking. If she blinked at any point, even just once, I could have told myself that I simply was suffering from some sort of mental breakdown. I could have told myself, as the doctors at this fine institution insist, that I was just going crazy, but she never, ever did. Now, I'll admit, from an outside perspective, my next decision may sound a touch drastic, but you have to understand my position. I was spending what felt like at least 12 hours each night just staring at Marie's unblinking, monstrously smiling face, her eyes boring into my own like power drills. Every day I felt weaker and more tired, the dreams weighing down upon me like a lead weight and sapping away any strength I should be getting from sleep. I had to kill her. I knew that if Marie was dead that I wouldn't have the dreams anymore. I just knew it. I will assert again, I am not insane. I am as healthy and stable as anyone could be given my situation, but I hadn't gotten any proper rest in weeks. My life was falling apart around me. When I got home from work I simply collapsed in bed and immediately would have the nightmares again. There was no freedom from that woman, that witch. I'd lost over a dozen pounds since I first met Marie, since I never had enough energy to cook proper food anymore, and only barely had the strength to get takeout once a day at the most. If I didn't kill her, she would kill me, do you understand? It was me or her, Madeline or Marie. The choice was obvious. I'll grant that I didn't have the most elegant plan in the world. She seemed to work 7 days a week, so I decided that I'd simply wait till one of the days I had off, lurk in the parking lot until she clocked out, bash her brains in with a baseball bat, and drag her body into the trunk of my car. I didn't really have much of an idea for what to do with the corpse beyond simply dumping it in the woods, but at that point I was so desperate to be free that I figured I didn't have time to plan things out that far ahead. Luckily, I did know what Marie's car looked like and where she tended to park. I'm not much of a car person, and in fairness, I was not in an emotional state conducive to thinking very clearly at the time, so I can't tell you the exact make and model, but it was just as inoffensive and blandly pleasant looking as she was. It was silver little subcompact, the sort of modestly priced vehicle with good gas mileage, and such a universal appeal that anybody could have owned it. The only reason I was able to distinguish it from the others of its kind was the custom license plate, SM1L3. I lay in wait for hours, slamming down energy drink after energy drink to keep myself awake and alert, keeping a sharp lookout. I got close to nodding off once or twice, but I stayed focused. I had a goal. I was going to take back my dreams from this grinning freak. It was a long, agonizing wait, but eventually my patience paid off, and I saw Marie come walking into the parking garage, still smiling that self-satisfied customer service grin. Conditions were nothing less than perfect. She hadn't seemed to notice me, and her path was such that there would be a brief opportunity where her back was facing me. Nobody else was around, and it was late in the evening. There would be no witnesses, no one around to hear if she tried to fight back. I steadied my breathing and tightened my grip around the baseball bat, readying myself to end the nightmare. Time slowed, the seconds seeming to drip like molasses, and in the silence of the parking garage, I could hear my heartbeats loud and clear. Finally, the moment came, and I lunged at her, swinging the bat with all my strength. As I let out a strangled cry of rage, I expected a thud, or perhaps a crunch, something like what they play in the movies when someone is hit with a blunt object. You know, that satisfying, meaty sound that lets you know someone isn't getting back up. It didn't sound like that at all though, not even in a little. Instead, there was a loud smashing noise, like a vase being dropped upon a tile floor, or a brick being tossed through a window. Regardless, Marie's body fell to the floor, limp and lifeless. There was no blood, but at the time I didn't think about this. I was too giddy with adrenaline to notice. I stuffed the baseball bat down the back of my hoodie so I could have both of my hands free, then started dragging the corpse back to my car. It was lighter than I expected. She couldn't have weighed more than 80 pounds at the most, which was drastically inconsistent with her height and apparent size. I figured beneath her concealing clothes, she must have been completely emaciated. I tossed the body in the trunk and drove home, cackling to myself as I did so. Again, I'm not crazy, I know how this sounds, but I was just so relieved. I was looking forward to a good night's sleep, to finally have a chance to rest. All I had to do was dispose of the body, and I was set. I would finally be free. I made it home without incident somehow, a minor miracle between the lack of proper rest and intense mix of emotions I was feeling from killing someone. As justified as it was, I still couldn't help but feel guilty. Taking a life, even that of some unnatural, idiotically grinning customer service sorceress, doesn't exactly rest easy upon one's conscience. As I pulled into the driveway, I was beginning to question myself, wondering if I had made the right decision. Surely she must have people who will miss her, I thought to myself. I began to worry about the police and started to consider the options I could take to dispose of the body. I came up with the idea, disposing of her clothes separately from the rest of the body in order to throw off the trail, thinking that if investigators found her clothes in the nearby river, they'd be unlikely to check the woods. I had one last task ahead of me before I could finally have a pleasant night's sleep, and I swallowed down another energy drink in order to keep myself awake. After making sure nobody else was around to see, I carried Marie's body into my garage and shut the door. I grabbed an old tarp and some duct tape that I planned to use to wrap the body, and then set about removing the clothes. I started with the shoes, pulling them off with ease. It was when I removed the socks that I got my first surprise. At first I assumed they must have been some sort of prosthetics. One foot was crudely hacked from wood, and the other seemed to have been taken from a department store mannequin of some sort. Unsettled, I decided to move up to the shirt instead, not wanting to have to deal with Marie's mismatched feet. I soon discovered, however, that if anything, the feet were the least strange part of her. As I pulled off her turtleneck, I was confronted with an utterly bewildering sight. I don't quite know how to describe it, not because it was in any way difficult to comprehend, but saying it back now just sounds almost silly. Her entire body seemed to be composed of nothing but, well, garbage. The main bulk of the torso was a loose sort of cage made from chicken wire, filled in with various nonsensical objects in the place of internal organs. There were two long, partially deflated balloons, of the sort a clown would use to make balloon animals. In the place of lungs, where the heart ought to have been, was a broken alarm clock, though I can't be sure if this was always broken, or if it was merely damaged in her fall to the ground. The stomach was a translucent, plastic grocery bag, filled with what looked to be the severed limbs of plastic dolls. Her intestines were a number of toy rubber snakes tied together. I could go on, naming the inane, utterly pointless knickknacks that made up the false body of Marie Vasilka. But it doesn't matter. None of it matters. My eyes wandered up to her face, that strangely perfect smile still stretched across her lips, eyes still open, staring blankly upwards. I could see now it was a mask of some sort, rubber and clearly fake. I have no idea how it had seemed so lifelike before. I pulled it off, trembling as I did so. Beneath the mask was one of those glass mannequin heads, the sort you use to display hats. The back of it shattered into 100 pieces from the force of the baseball bat. It was filled with a string of unpowered Christmas lights. I didn't bother taking off the rest of the clothes. I just wrapped it up in the tarp, clothes and all, and dumped it about a mile into the woods, around 100 yards off the side of the highway. I mean, it's not like it was an actual body. The most I could get in trouble for was littering. By the time I finished disposing of Ms. Vasilka's remains, it was nearly 1 in the morning, and I was well overdue for some sleep. My mind was utterly unable to process what I had experienced, and I was completely numb to the impossible thing I had seen. All I felt was a desire to go to bed and have the whole affair over and done with. Rationalizing what happened was a problem for the next day's Madeline. Of course, it wasn't that simple. Why would it be? Whatever powers that be have clearly decided that my life is clearly not one which is meant for happiness. This time there was no build-up, no wandering through the aisles of the grocery store. I simply lay down in bed, closed my eyes, and then I was there in the office, face to face with that thing. It wasn't wearing the mask anymore, nor clothes. It just sat there, staring without eyes, a blank, transparent glass head filled with softly shining Christmas lights, atop a body composed of nonsense and garbage. Even without a face, I could tell it was smiling at me. And so I stared at this thing, this mockery of the human form, until my eyes burned with the effort to keep them open, and I once again awoke screaming. But that wasn't what got me locked up in this nut house as a madwoman. Oh no, not in the slightest. It was what awaited me when I arrived back at work the next day, exhausted and borderline suicidal. I walked into the break room to clock in, only to find all was adorned with ribbons and balloons, with a big cake on the table, decorated with the words "Happy Birthday, Marie." In the corner of the room sat a punch bowl and a number of glasses. Many of my coworkers were already digging into their own slices of cake and chatting pleasantly as they drank from glasses of punch. I stared at the decorations blankly, wondering when they would notice that Marie wasn't here for her own celebration. Then I felt a familiar, hard tap upon my shoulder. "Hello, Maddie." I turned and saw her smiling, as always. She looked none the worse for wear, despite having been hit with a baseball bat, wrapped in a tarp and dumped in the woods. "Why aren't you smiling, Maddie? This is a party after all. Feel free to have some cake and punch." From behind me, someone dropped their glass, a loud shattering noise piercing the haze of polite small talk and idle chatter. I was reminded of the sound Marie's head made when I smashed the back of it with my baseball bat. What happened next? Well, I'm not exactly proud of what I did, but you can hardly blame me, can you? I'd been through so much, and I'll admit I lost my temper. I can appreciate that without context. Seeing your coworker grab a cake knife and try to slash at your manager's face while screaming you're not a real person does seem somewhat alarming. I'm not surprised that they held me down and called the police. I'm not surprised that they took me here. What was surprising though, what keeps me from just getting better and becoming a functional member of society again, is how many others there are. I'm sure you've seen it, haven't you? The way the receptionist never stops smiling, how effortlessly polite all the orderlies are, how the doctors always seem to maintain eye contact just a bit too long for comfort. I still had those dreams, you know, those terrible, agonizingly long dreams. But Marie isn't the only one staring now. There are so many of them. The above statement was given by Madeline Engelhardt, a patient at the psychiatric hospital. Her former manager, Marie Vasilka, has declined any requests for interviews, beyond stating that she wishes Maddie the best in her recovery. Police did investigate the spot where Ms. Engelhardt claimed to have dumped the body described in the above narrative, concerned that perhaps in her delusional state, she did in fact commit a murder, simply hallucinating that the victim was Marie Vasilka. Investigation did not recover any body, though an old tarp was found at the scene, along with a partially shattered glass mannequin head.